And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless.
Awesome. Hey guys, we're live tonight on Standing for Truth. We've got Praise I Am That I Am. We've got One Way and Jason here. So we're going to have some fun. Tonight's discussion, it's just going to be an organic conversation for the most part between all of us. We've got two topics. We're going to start with biblical slavery. That's why we've got Praise and One Way here. They are the experts on that topic. So they're going to kind of make their case. Praise has a new book out on that topic as well. So he's going to go over some of the atheist arguments and refute them. The second part of our night will consist of evolution. I've titled it Evolution Rescue Device Night. So we're going to go over some arguments and rescue devices coming from the evolutionists, and we are going to refute those. And during that portion as well, when the biblical slavery portion is done, if anyone's interested in jumping in here, creationists or even evolutionists, let us know, and we'll have Praise send you the link. So we're just looking for a good couple hours tonight. And some good back and forth. So enough from me. Going to hand it over to the biblical slavery experts, guys. Thanks for being here. Take it away.
Yeet. What's up, guys? So, yeah, I already seen someone wanted us to recommend for us to cover Leviticus 25:46. Yeah, so we'll cover that first because that's obviously the glaring one that everyone wants to talk about. So. When you exegete these passages in Leviticus 25:44 through 46, you have to remove your modern lenses of understanding. You can't come to the text with a modern viewpoint, like I would say antebellum slavery, where you have whites versus blacks and whites slaving blacks. And you have these, if you come to the presupposition like that's the case, that there's these races, then you're perverting the text. You're actually what they call eisegesis. You're adding your own biases into the text. But see, here's where you have to break down these passages. You have to understand there is no such thing as foreigners in the ancient Near East. If Wumwe wants to expound upon that, you can. Go ahead, Wumwe.
Yeah, sure. So it's not just that, and we're commonly accused of conflating the critic's position with antebellum slavery. That's not the point. They're the ones making these ethnical distinctions. And so when I point out a passage, right, like in Klaus Wilke's book, Ancient Near East, right, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law, where he says that legal punishments weren't decided based on ethnic distinctions, it's not the concept of this, the conceptual scheme of antebellum slavery that's the issue. It gets even worse. It comes down to the very word meanings. As Dr. John Botterill notes in his work, right, Mesopotamia, writing, reasoning, the gods, historians have to keep in mind that concepts and words are fluid. They have dynamic ranges of meanings. And so they have to be understood in their historical cultural milieu. And that's the way we should look at these things. So it's not just the broader scope. It actually goes down to the very word meanings, individual word meanings.
Yeah, well said. I just had to add someone in here because I didn't know they came in here. My bad. Watchman Signal. Is that Tony, or I'm not sure who that is. I'm just refixing the boxes real quick. I'm gonna supply some citation for that to show there is no ethical distinction in ancient Near East. Oh well, I guess I can do. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, nice to have you, Watchman. We're just talking about slavery. If you have something to add to that.
Mm-hmm. So one would be Klaus Wilke in his book, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law, where he actually says that juridical decisions weren't based on ethnicity. But remember, it's actually the critics. It's actually the critics making ethnic distinctions when we come to Leviticus 25.
This one card guy is saying.
Yeah, great point there. And so, I guess other. Go ahead, Watch.
Can't hear a word you're saying. Why? Let me check my volume stuff.
So I'm not sure. Yeah. So I wanna expound upon that a little bit and add to that. So what's my thing is I'm not sure what's going on here. I just don't know who that is. I'm just gonna have to. I'm just gonna take him off right now because I just don't.
Yeah, I would recommend you just get rid of him. He's usually a troll. Go ahead.
Did he get on my server? Is that where he got it from?
I don't know. I think he joined from your server link. Yes.
So I can't do that no more.
So back to the ethnic distinctions. Klaus Wilke writes in his book that juridical or judicial distinctions weren't made in ancient Near Eastern law based on race, based on bioethnicity or ethnic distinctions. He actually says that.
Correct. So how do we explain? So what is it when in Leviticus 25:46 it says that they shall be inherited for perpetuity or forever? What does that mean? And what we found out through one way, especially through citations, is these people would be adopted that are non-Yahwist. So that was the distinction. The distinction in the ancient Near East. I'm going to give you a citation for that and read it. 1 second. I'm just trying to fix the stupid chat thing.
Okay. Yeah, I could think over why you find the citation. But yeah, basically the idea was the only time ethnic distinctions in ancient or Eastern law were made when it comes to inheritance rights. And so folks like the Newsy adoption tablets or records, if you look at them, what they actually demonstrate is that because of these distinctions, this is like literally the only circumstance in which ancient Near Eastern law scholars agree that there were ethnic distinctions. And it has to do with inheritance rights or rights of redemption or pledges. What you get when you analyze this information is that because of this restriction of ethnic distinctions in the case of inheritance and passing on your property, especially in the case of famine or destitution, you get what is called a fictive adoption or manumission scenario. So if you look at the Newsy contracts, which mention Habaru doing this, you get the same sort of thing going on here in Leviticus 25. So Jacob Milgram, for example, in his JPS commentary on Leviticus, mentions that there's a downward spiral, right, of a famished Israelite farmer. And then he gets to the last step, and then he says, well, this is talking about him securing, him being reduced to a resident hireling. But if you look up what a resident hireling is, and then you look up in conjunction with that in Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, it's referring to people as inherited property in a legal sense. In other words, it's explaining away that a famished Israelite farmer could adopt a person who is not in the Israelite category, but it is still in the Hebrew or Semitic category, so that he could secure the passing along of his inheritance for redemption rights. That's quite a different thing. We don't think about it that way today, but that's the breakdown of Leviticus 25. And then on top of this, it's actually talking about manumission. Once you adopt a person who is not a part of your family, then they receive the same inheritance rights. And then they're also, by the way, freed of being of a slave status. So if you read Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, when it's talking about bequeathing or taking sons and daughters and inheriting them, that sort of language, what it's describing is actually adopting them and then freeing them from the slave status and then incorporating them into the community. Did you find your citation, Praise?
Yeah, and I kind of want to clarify what you mean by slave status. Because people think of slave status, oh no, we're talking about someone being forced against their will, like they're being subjugated. No, we don't. When we mean slave status in the ancient Near East, it was a relative term. I'm going to show that with also Raymond Westbrook, who is a top-notch ancient Near East scholar. But here's my quote though. Quote, from our historical vantage point, there is probably little about these prohibited practices that was essentially non-Israelite. Instead, certain norms became associated with proper Yahwism by the Deuteronomistic party, and because Yahweh was the national deity, all unapproved practices became foreign by default. So idols, so the distinction is idols, not races, not genetic. So people need to get that out. this type of viewpoint. They need to come to the ancient Near East and come to that culture, come and understand that culture. And so it continues on this quote, "It is very difficult to imagine how these indexes could actually be employed to distinguish the Israelites from the foreigners on a day-to-day basis. Instead, it appears that the objective of Deuteronomy was not so much to distinguish foreigners from Israelites, Judeans, as it was to distinguish proper Yahwism from either improper Yahwism or non-Yahwistic foreign activities. If this is the case, we should expect that all the foreign Israelite dichotomy in Deuteronomy was mostly rhetorical and polemical. And we should also expect that the boundaries that excluded foreigners were not as firm as Deuteronomy's holy war might suggest." And the so that's what this
you'll get that attested to as well in Tige's commentary on Deuteronomy, by the way.
Yep, and that was from Kenton Sparks, and it was in this citation from Ethnicity and Identity in Ancient Israel, so you can check that out.
And there was a type of slavery where if you owed someone money, you didn't have to pay any more than 7% interest, but you had something like 7 years to pay it off, and if you defaulted on your payments after, say, 3 years, then you'd be their servant or their slave for 4 years for the remainder of the debt. And once that 4 years was over, then you were free. And a lot of people that got in that situation decided to stay rather than go out and fend for themselves. So there was people that,
Well,
it was a form of social security, sort of.
That's what it was. Yeah. So let me add on to that. Karen Renemet actually says in her work Daily Life in Mesopotamia that their entire social stratum was based on economics. It was a welfare system. They didn't have like in our country social security, but this is like their version of social security. Even the social classes were based on your labor input and output, and then integration into the society. But
they had to be fed and looked after in a certain way and given, comfortable quarters to sleep with, food and so they got food and board and they got to pay off their loan, and it's a pretty good deal really, and living in a hotel where you worked for your keep.
Right. So Karen Reina Nemeneja says that the Mesopotamian system was based on labor output and then social status, and that she actually says that legal penalties weren't based on ethnic distinctions. Like it literally played no role in ancient Mesopotamia. But I gave you an example, right, where there's inheritance customs. That's why these folks adopted these what are called fictive adoption and manumission laws, especially in famine situations, like Raymond Westbrook points out. But I definitely want to quote Klaus Wilke to buttress what Praise was talking about. This is from his book, Early Ancient Near Eastern Law. On page 50, he says, there is no evidence that such different kinds of identity, he just got done discussing about ethnic identity, had also a bearing on the legal status of persons. So the idea is that it's actually formatted, the conceptual schema for jurisprudence is based on social classes and not ethnicity. Why is that important? Because if you read the critics, they're the ones making ethnic distinctions. Like when we come to Leviticus 25, they're going to say that's talking about, a non-ethnic Israelite. Do you have anything to add to that, Praise?
Yeah, I think Raymond Westbrook's quote um, on the ancient Near East, the socioeconomic system, or even this, the whole social fabric of that whole entire area. We're talking from Israel to Egypt, all around that area in the ancient Near East. Here's what he says. I think this quote should illuminate some understanding. So here we go. Freedom in the ancient Near East was a relative, not an absolute state, as the ambiguity of the term for slave in all the region's language illustrates. Slave could be used to refer to a subordinate in the social ladder. Thus, the subjects of a king were called slaves, even though they were free citizens. The king himself, if a vassal, was the slave of his emperor. Kings, emperors, and commoners alike were slaves of the gods. Even a social inferior, when addressing a social superior, referred to himself out of politeness as your slave. There were, moreover, a plethora of servile conditions that were not regarded as slavery, such as the son, daughter, wife, serf, or human pledge. So this is from Raymond Westbrook's book. This is, let's see here, A History of the Ancient Near East, log, volume 2, 4.51. So it's just servitude. The whole thing was work and labor. And it wasn't imposed labor, it wasn't subjugation. There was no such thing as subjugation in the ancient Near East. It couldn't even happen. For one reason is because there's only one master, not gangs of taskmasters, like what real slavery in some other previous times in that area in Egypt. And they actually, remember the Israelites were under, and I would say, a type of subjugation there. But it's funny because even ancient Near East scholars say that wasn't even subjugation either. So
Right, it was still voluntary under suzerain vassal treatise covenant.
right, exactly. So I think people need to bust these misconceptions they have about modern context of slavery in the ancient Near East. So to address these passages in Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, you have people that are in conditions where they're in conditions where they can't get out of debt, maybe. Famines, like what one way was talking about. And what they would do is they would go to the court through a legal process and become the masters through their lifetime. So this is what we mean by forever in the Hebrew. So if you go to Leviticus 25:46, I'm going to go there real quick. I'll actually read the passage out to people. Just going to pull it up 1 second here. So, and you shall take them as your inheritance for your children after you shall inherit them as a possession. Achuzah. That's the word in the Hebrew, achuzah. They shall be your bondmen forever. See that word forever there in Hebrew, which I'm going to give you a citation for, is olam, but it means for the master's life or when the Jubilee came, the 50th year. That's what that means. Olam in the Hebrew actually just means a particular amount of time, or an extended amount of time.
Right, it just means an age.
Yeah, an age or whatever. And I mean, I'll give you. Hold on, I'm going to give you some citation for that, so people to check out for themselves. Well, if you want to talk real quick, I'm going to get the citation.
Okay. No, that's on par. So usually when they read it, they're saying that it's like until the Jubilee ends every 50 years, but that's not the case. We know that from Jacob Milgram in page 2230, where he says, and citing Mendelssohn, that the Jubilee doesn't apply to the foreigner.
Correct. So the word forever there is misleading in the English. So I want people to take a note on this, that olam, that's what the word is in the Hebrew. That's what we are concerned about, or what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you some quotes. I'm just pulling them up. So I'll show you. I'm going to give you some actually Jewish commentary that actually demonstrates this is what's going on. Dum bum 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 bum. So, but here's another thing too. Even if you think that there's something fishy about that, well, you can just dispel that the whole thing in Leviticus 25:46 real quickly. All you have to do is look up Ezekiel 44:28, because God Himself is called the property of Israel, and He's going to be inherited forever. So if you're going to take the same context in Leviticus 25:46, bring it to Ezekiel 44:28, because would that make sense? Would people really be saying that they could slave God forever? Like God is a slave to the Israelites? No, there's no Hebrew scholar, there's no scholar out there. I mean, there's no biblical scholar, no Christian scholar, no ancient Near East scholar, no scholar, period, would ever say that or ever claim that. So you have to understand context, and this is what I'm trying to tell people. You have to have a little bit of understanding of history and ancient Near East to gain some insight. That's what people need to have, is insight. God, when He wrote when the writers of the Tanakh, when they wrote the Bible, God didn't need to supply all this historical information. He expects people to do it themselves. So when Moses wrote Leviticus 25, it wasn't like that was needed to explain all this stuff. I mean, who is God to be questioned anyway? A perfect God, like the perfect God. He's perfect. So the one who is making the claim has the burden of proof. I'm still trying to dig up some of these citations, but generally, olam, forever in the Hebrew, is when the master died, or the 50th year of the Jubilee. So that explains why they would be inheritance forever, because they would go through the process of manumission. And these people would have some type of debt problem, famines, etc. So they couldn't work themselves out with debt. So what they would do is they would cling to a master through a legal process. And here's the thing that people don't even know about, is that all the stuff from the master would go to the Eved, the servant there. So it's not like he's just working there for the master and just doing a bunch of stuff. The master bequeaths all his stuff to the servant in Leviticus 25:46. And I'm going to try to dig some citation up for that. It's in my book. Like, I have it, everything detailed and cited. And one way help me out with that. So does anyone have any questions? I mean, so far else about Leviticus 25? Is there anything that's controversial? Put it in the chat and I will address it. So is there any misunderstanding in the chat? Just let me know. So it was actually of a good deed that the master would do for allowing manumission through adoption. And
One way dropped out.
yeah, he did. And I think you know why too, right, Jason?
No.
Oh, okay. The wifey.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm
No,
taking
sorry, I'm a bit slow.
I'm taking notes here, and I think everything you're presenting is really good, and I really recommend your book. I think just kind of listening to what you're saying, listening to some of the debates you've had, these atheists argue slavery from emotion. It seems like they don't actually study the word
No, they
praise
don't.
and what the Bible actually means. You know, God is not promoting slavery. God is making an allowance for slavery in certain situations. For example, people can't pay a bill, or prisoners of war, criminals, and people who have to work off debts. Now, something important for the atheists and everybody in the chat, the Bible says in Exodus chapter 1, I can't remember the exact verse, so I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, but it says, he that stealeth a man or selleth him or be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death.
Yep.
So what most of these atheists think of as slavery, praise, is punished by the death penalty. Like, why can't they get that through their heads, right? If you steal a man and sell him, you will be put to death. Or even if you are a participant, this verse says, you will be put to death as well. Like, even if you're just caught transporting these slaves or something. So is the Bible just pro-slavery? Of course not. And even just to make an analogy of it, an analogy in regards to, say, biblical servitude would be if somebody was eating at a restaurant, for example, but then for whatever reason couldn't pay their bill, they paid the bill by spending a few hours in the back washing dishes, right? What do people do today? Because these atheists think that they know more than God, you know, they're better than God. But what do they do today? People constantly don't pay people back. People who own businesses will tell you over and over again that people, don't pay them back, for example, or they just go bankrupt, for example. Is that right, praise? No, that's not biblical. We should pay back what we borrow. So in the Bible, what if somebody commits a crime, for example, like theft, and have to pay back fourfold, as the Bible would say, but they are then incapable of paying that fine? Well, what would they have to do? They'd have to go to work for that person and be that bondservant and pay back their debt. And to me, rightfully so. What do we do to those types of people today, for example? Well, we lock them up in prisons, and locking somebody up in prison for their entire life, or 10 years or 15 years, is worse than servitude, as the Bible would teach. So unjust prison sentences for these types of things just ruin people's lives, ruin people's families. So the Bible is right in everything that it says and does. And atheists, like I said at the very beginning of everything I'm saying here, is they argue from emotion. And the exact type of slavery that they think the Bible is teaching is literally condemned. And those types of people who are involved in that type of slavery, according to Exodus 21, are sentenced to the death penalty. So that's just my take on it, praise.
Yeah, well said. But I think another problem is they import their modern understanding of reality into these ancient texts, and that is self-refuting. It doesn't work, and it's also eisegesis of Scripture anyway.
Right. Well, because if they were to just look at the type of slavery that they're thinking of based on their modern day view or worldview of it, or just looking at some really bad, movies on slavery or something like that, then they could actually look at the Bible in Exodus, for example, where it condemns that type of slavery to death. But
Right. But you'll get pushback from atheists. They'll say, "Well, no, that's only talking about Israelites." But already, see, they made a foreigner distinction there when there is no such thing as a foreigner or non-foreigner.
Good point. It's that's a really good point. It just makes so much, because everything God teaches, everything that the Bible teaches, when you put away your emotion, is the best for humanity, for example.
Right.
And that's why I emphasize today, people go bankrupt, or they just don't pay people back, or the government puts them into prison for the rest of their lives and ruins their lives and ruins their families' lives, for example. But biblical servitude is very just, and it makes sense. So yeah, you're making a lot of good points, man. Continue on.
And what you're talking about there, you should not steal a man. But actually, if you look at that word man in the Hebrew, ish, in Job, he uses that word ish in the Hebrew to mean all mankind. So there is no foreign distinction. But also, that word is used in a universal sense anyway. So tell atheists or their skeptics to look up the word ish and then quote them Job. Actually, I'll get you I'll cite you the verse real quick. You can see for yourself. So what is my navigation that's so off tonight? It's weird. So hopefully people know what's going on with Leviticus 25 now. So I think it's Job 20 something. I don't know. I can't. So what you have in Leviticus 25 is you have people that can't work their way out of debt, and it's either through famines or something serious, like not mental. I mean, like financial problems that are just unredeemable. Like they can't be helped. So what they do is they would go to a master and be adopted through the master's life. But like I said, they would be bequeathed all the stuff from the master anyway, and they would be manumitted. Manumission means free from their contract. So that's all it's talking about there. That's what it means forever. And olam in the Hebrew means the master's life or the jubilee. And in my book, I'll give all the citations. Maybe this is just a bad document. Hold on real quick. I'm going to have to dig some of this stuff up. And then exactly what Standing for Truth was saying too. Yes, stealing people would be a death penalty anyway. So that's a great point. I'm going to give you the Joe passage now. Eesh. So I recommend people get familiar with the Hebrew too sometimes, like a lexicon, Strong's Concordance, Thayer or like BDB, just some type of something that has a Hebrew scholar that has training in a lexicographer. And that should be sufficient to get understanding what's going on with some of these words like mankind. And so now I think another big one that people talk about is Exodus 20. Like you'll have Matt Dillahunty, like one of the most infamous atheists that says that God just permits people to beat the heck out of each other as long as they don't die. And that is a distortion and a straw man caricature of what's happening in the text. Now, if you go to Exodus 21, you want to start at Exodus 21 and start from verse 20. And what I want to point out here is that these are classified as a group of passages. These are what we call they go as a group, but I'm gonna hold on one second. I'm still pulling up my citations real quick. So yeah, these go as a group. You can't exegete these scriptures one by one, and it becomes very problematic, and it actually perverts the text when you start doing that. So what atheists do is they approach these texts with a prima facie outlook without studying ancient Near East culture. And what these texts are called is for instance law codes, casuistic law. So what happens with for instance law codes is you extrapolate legal principles from these laws. These are not independent laws. They are a series of law codes that are connected. So you have verses 20 through 21. One is talking about an instance where a master is not punished. And then one's talking about the death penalty. And then you have within the same series the same thing with a woman that has child. If the child is not hurt, then there is no death penalty. If the child does get hurt and dies, then there is the death penalty, which also shows that the Bible's against abortion. So you have to go through Exodus 21, 20 through about 27. So there's 7 verses connected to each other. So here's how casuistic law code works. So with the verses that have nothing to do with dying, so you have two passages that do not talk about dying.
One way's backstage.
Oh, okay, good. So one tard's back. Yay, there's one tard.
Go ahead, Praise. Thank you, guys.
Go ahead, one way.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to point out that even a person named Douglas A. Knight wrote a book called War, Justice, and what have you. And he actually disputes the lex talionis application of law based on the village or tribal situations.
Yeah, so you had two instances in Exodus 21, 20 through 27. You had one instance where there would be no death penalty, and you would have one without. So the one without is called lex talionis. And it's hand for hand, foot for foot, bruise for bruise, whatever you want to call it. That's what it requires. So in Exodus 21, if a man smite his servant and is made with the rod, he shall die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. This requires the death penalty. But if he did not die, then the lex talionis comes into effect. And you ask, well, what happens then if he doesn't die? Well, it's part of the series of codes here. Go down to verse 26. What does it say? This is so simple, people. And if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid that it perish, he shall let him go free. It means that not only is the servant freed, there's also a penalty, a financial penalty. So that's what happens with the lex talionis. And the same thing is going on with the woman. If the woman was beaten and then, somehow the child is okay, then there would still be a fine. So both are working with casuistic law codes. Yeah. Okay. So these are called casuistic law codes. It's Exodus 21:20 through 27. For instance, laws. You can't. It's actually incorrect to just take one passage out of those passages and interpret it. So they go as a series, and so you have two possibilities. Like I said, one with a death penalty and one without. And the one without enforces the lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, bruise for bruise, and whatever you want to call it. And in the instance of a beaten slave that didn't die, the lex talionis for that is to free their out of their other contractual obligation. They be freed with a fine. So that's what happened with that. But here's another thing.
Real quick.
I can.
What Praise just said. I'm just pointing out that this is the funny thing about this when you get into the scholarly realm. I'm pointing out that you have another scholar, Douglas A. Knight, who wrote a book, Justice in Ancient Israel, where he argues that they never actually excised the lex talionis. This is the funny thing about when you run into people like a Dr. Josh.
Praise, it sounds like they can't hear me or so it sounds like they can only hear you, Praise.
Okay.
I have no idea. It says they are back, so
I can hear.
Yeah.
But I can
they can hear us
now.
now.
So I'm not sure what the issues were.
Toilet paper,
Okay.
toilet paper.
Whatever it was, Praise secretly fixed behind the scenes. Praise actually hit the mute button of all of us except. I see how it is.
What one way is trying to convey to the audience that these laws are not even legislative in the first place. That we even have, we can give oodles upon oodles of citation for that. That is the majority viewpoint in the ancient Near East, that there is no laws in the ancient Near East that are legislative. What does that mean? It means that God didn't command any of it. It's not prescriptive. So how could you even connect it to God in the first place?
It literally would mean that God didn't give us any moral rules. That's what it would mean. So then when a skeptic comes to that, when we say, well, God is the foundation of morality, and then he says, well, here's this law in Exodus, we go, well, that's not a morally prescriptive legislative law. Game over. It's done.
Yep. That means that God didn't officially command it. Now, some scholars say that the Decalogue was definitely commanded and prescriptive. Some say that, but not even all that. There's some that even say that wasn't even legislative.
Right. So to go back, what Praise was saying, it's already the majority of scholarship in the ancient Near Eastern legal scholarship and the Old Testament scholarship that the conditional laws weren't legislative. But there's still debate on the unconditional laws, like the Ten Commandments, which aren't given any what's called a protasis or apodosis form, like an if-then.
Correct. So I hope people understand now. We can cover this both ways. We can actually, if you want to use and say these are legislative, we address that legislatively. They're casuistic laws, if-then laws. They come as a series of laws.
Oh, yeah. Let me add to that real quick, Praise. Yeah, so when you look at ancient Near Eastern law collections, and then you look at Exodus 21, there's a particular feature which is really interesting that skeptics do when they analyze this, right? They're going to say, for example, Exodus 21:16. We're going to say, yeah, that's talking about what we would call modern slavery, and in fact, it prohibits it, right? But then when we go down to beating slaves, then they're going to start to make syntactical distinctions between Exodus 21, 1 through 7, and then Exodus 21, 20 through 21, and Exodus 26 through 27. But if they followed their exegesis consistently, then they would have to say that that only applies to ethnic Israelites. But they don't do that. So, in other words, you could argue using your own exegesis, skeptic, right? You're the one making ethnic distinctions rather than social class distinctions. That this only actually applies to ethnic Israelites. This whole beating of slaves thing, or in the case of Exodus 26 through 27, reciprocity. It only applies to the ethno-Israelites. You see what I mean? Like, it's so inconsistent, and that's what Mendelssohn points out in his work on slavery. Who's another ancient Near Eastern legal scholar. Go ahead, though, Praise.
Yeah,
Like,
great points. Yeah.
they are completely arbitrary when they do this. Using their logic, in other words, we could only beat Hebrew slaves.
Yeah.
But
So
what is a Hebrew slave to them? It's an ethnic distinction. So we could only beat the ethnic Israelites.
right, and there is no such thing in the ancient Near East as an ethnic anything. It was non-Yahwist or Yahwist. That's it. That's the distinction. They didn't
Exactly
know
right.
there was no black people, brown people, yellow people, white people. It was just non-Yahwist or Yahwist.
Right, and this all makes sense of passages that are early on, like Leviticus 19:34, where it talks right about treating foreigners. Again, it's treating it as social class. It's not ethnic distinctions. And folks in the land the same way. You get the same flavor in Numbers 15:16. There's to be one law for both the foreigner, right, if we're using English translations, and the non-foreigner. But what they want to do is overturn those and say that there's a law for the foreigners and there's a law for the ethnic I guess non-foreigners. It just doesn't make any sense. You run into serious contradictions when you try to take that approach. Here's what I would challenge anybody to do. Pick up Dr. Joshua Bone's book, where he makes these ethnic distinctions that I would say that they are artificial syntactical distinctions, and then just apply them back and forth, right? So I gave you an example already. This example in Exodus 21, right, about beating your slaves. Is he seriously going to say that we can only beat Hebrew ethnic slaves? Like, is he saying we can only beat our Hebrew slaves?
Right.
See, this is how absurd it gets. Now go through the other passages, and I would challenge folks to look at that.
Great point.
It's very arbitrary. Go ahead, Praise.
Yeah, I also wanted to add in, well, why even bring up a stick? You know, like so the rod. Why even show a rod? Because isn't that indicative of slavery? No, these are hypothetical objects. And I'm going to show you this is no more common practice than a hand of iron, a throwing stone. It even have in Numbers 35, it brings up a staff. I mean Exodus 21:18 uses a staff. So there's nothing that's indicative of anything here. It's just a hypothetical object. That's all it is. And so what is the rod indicative of anyway? It's indicative of authority. And you can read this in 2 Samuel 7:14, Ezekiel 19:11, 14, and Psalms 89:32. But here's the point. Yeah, go ahead.
You can also validate this by looking up ancient figurative language dictionaries about what the rod and ring signify in ancient Near Eastern scholarship, and they all do say that. It's either a measuring device or a symbol of authority. That's what they all say.
Yeah. So it wasn't there just to beat people. It's there for like we were saying, for measuring or even for authority. But here's another thing too. You're going to say, well, why is the days? Why does it say that it took a few days? Well, that's a great question, because it's actually used to deliberate to see if the one who's making the claim, which would be the servant or a ved, to see if they would be making this up and trying to fraud their master. I mean, they would be concocting this up to get out of their contract. Does anyone see a loophole in verses 26 through 27? It actually says if they're hit in any way, fashion, or form, that they would be released out of their contract. So they could make stuff up and get out of it.
That's correct. You get the same loophole being mentioned by Dr. Bruce Wells in the redacted version of this in the book of Deuteronomy. Like, it's so, you could accuse somebody of doing something to you without any repercussions, right? So then how did they deal with that? They waited a while to look for more forthcoming witnesses.
Exactly.
You get the same thing. You get the same thing going on there.
And there's citations in my book from scholars that actually say this. I'll read it right here. Here's one of them. According to the plain meaning of the text and consonance with the practice of the Torah, we can simply translate this as he does not even have to survive 2 days for the master to not be accused of murder. Even a survival of 24 hours is sufficient. We find a parallel construction in Deuteronomy 17:6 on the basis of a testimony of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses. So that's what they're waiting for. That's what they have to deliberate on to see if this wasn't made up. It's a loophole.
That's right. You get the same thing in Deuteronomy, like I said. Yep, absolutely. You get the same thing in Deuteronomy.
So, if you have like atheists or skeptics tell you, well, I mean, look, there's a rod there, and that just shows their slavery. Well, tell them, read Numbers 35. That's no more indicative of slavery than a hand of iron, a stone, or even a stick in Exodus 21:28.
Well, especially when you get folks like Dr. Josh in his book who appeals to Psalms, which are wisdom figurative literature. That's the genre. Then you have to ask, what is indicative of a rod? Well, it's a symbol of authority. That's it.
Yep.
Why are you utilizing Psalms, right? A figurative wisdom provocation genre, and then trying to relate that to historical text?
Yep.
That like you have to put a bit of more meat on those bones, I guess I would say. Anyhow, I really do have to get off of here. My wife's not very happy with me.
Oh man, I appreciate you adding all your input.
But here's
coming on one way. You're always
here's the important thing that you have to figure out. All of the ancient Near Eastern scholars say that these aren't rules. You get some scholars saying that they became rules around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. In other words, during the intertestamental period, sometime between the ending or closing of the Old Testament, leading into the New Testament. You have to keep that stuff in mind. This is why it's important to recognize what is called, the naturalist fallacy. What they're saying is this describes prescriptions, and we ought to do that. Well, no, these are right. If it is the case that these are descriptions of judicial decisions people made that are recorded by folks in the Old Testament, rather than being morally prescriptive laws, then you're committing a fundamental logical fallacy, namely the is-ought problem, right? What is descriptive doesn't necessarily end up being prescriptive. It's an inherent. It's like somebody saying the dolphins are gay, right? The dolphins are gay, so we ought to be gay. I mean, it's just a fundamental logical fallacy. I guess I will leave it at that. That's what these people are stuck with, when they try to pin these on us as rules, right? The ancient Near Eastern scholarship is saying they aren't rules, or even if they are rules, they're morally prescriptive rules. So now you have a different problem. Are you equivocating between different kinds of prescription, right? John Botterill argues that these are prescriptive in the medical omen or scientific sense rather than a moral one. So I think we have to consider these things, look at the Old Testament background, and consider that. So when an atheist comes to you and says, there's slavery in the Bible, therefore, right, people made laws about slavery in the Bible, therefore, you should be doing that. Well, okay, dolphins are gay in reality, so therefore, we should all be homosexuals. That's the logic behind it. It's the descriptive, it's the prescription versus description fallacy. But I look forward to seeing, listening in. Thanks for having me, Standing for Truth, and look forward to listening to what you guys have to say in the second part here. Unless praise could probably go on for hours, like I could about that.
I'm gonna probably conclude this coming up here.
Actually, Praise, if you could, maybe open up your book and just spend the next 10 hours reading it, every single word.
Yeah, I'm gonna show you my 100,000 citations. I want you to read every single one.
During the
from beginning to end.
That's what happened to SMT this last debate.
We should pause the clock on our 50-minute discussion, and we'll give you 35 minutes to study this paper real quick.
There you go. So, I mean, I'll just like recapitulate everything that we talked about tonight. So we talked about Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. There is no racial distinction or foreigner or ethnical distinction. These people were all working together in a socioeconomical system, and the only distinctions they really had was classes of people. Poor, really poor. So if you're really, really poor, you could be manumitted through adoption. You can be adopted by a master, and the master would take care of you until he died. Then he would bequeath all his stuff to you, and that's what Leviticus 25, 44 through 46 is talking about. Someone that's a farmer, someone that's been through a famine, someone that can't be redeemed because they're just so far in debt. But they could go through a legal process called manumission and get adopted by a master. And I mean, that's still a good situation. There's nothing there that's imposing or anything.
Or adopt a foreigner to secure their estate and then pass on the inheritance. Yeah, absolutely.
And there's nothing foul. There's nothing severe. There's no subjugation there. And that's what the words mean forever anyway. It just means the master's life. And I have in my book, I'm going to give you a couple citations for that. But that sums up Leviticus 25. So, I mean, in Exodus 21, though, these, okay, you can go two ways. You can grant that these laws were legislative, which really no scholar says they are. So, but even if we grant the atheist or the skeptic and say that these are legislative somehow, you can still address it. You can say, well, these are this is called casuistic law. For instance, laws. So they come as a series of laws in Exodus 21 through 27, 28. And what these series of laws cover is an abortion, like some type of kid that gets killed in some type of feud, and then also a beated or like a supposedly beated slave or servant. And if the servant or the child lives, then the law of lex talionis comes into effect, and they would either have to pay a fine or let the the servant go out of their contract. But the reason why it took several days is to deliberate to see if this wasn't concocted and made up to fraud their master. And the rod is indicative of authority. So those are the two main ones, but there's another one in Deuteronomy 21 I want to cover too. I want to try to get this done quickly because we're going to switch over to evolution.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, because Shadow Dancer thought that
That's a good summary.
Thought that we were wrapping it up, and I said no. I'm pretty sure he's just wrapping up this part of the part of the the thing. As you know, as I've thought that in the past too, but. Yeah, no, I'll just tell her.
Bray said I could talk about this for like 14 hours with Dr. Josh and Skylar Fiction in the room.
Yep. We really could. We can go on and on with this stuff. There's so much stuff to learn about the ancient Near East. And like numbskulls and imbeciles think that they can just read one verse prima facie and make a claim about it. So it's so, like Matt Dillahunty. Like, you can just laugh at him. What an ignoramus. What a pea brain. He even makes himself look stupid. What an idiot. So here's the last part. See, people will say, well, look, Deuteronomy 20 says if Israel goes to fight a certain tribe of people or a certain people, that they can take people as plunder, women and children as plunder. Well, that turns out not to be true either. If you actually look up these words, the net translators and we have other citations that show my book that is vassalage. They are the vassalage of Israel. And what does that mean? It means that they were part of a suzerain vassal treaty. Now, Israel was the suzerain, and we'd have all the other peoples or other non-Yahwists. If they were non-Yahwists, they were still part of the treaty, and they agreed to certain terms of labor for the suzerain. And under that contract, that would take effect there. So in Deuteronomy 20, it says you can take. I'm going to have to go to the specific passage here, because I'm sure you're going to hear this from atheists too, that, well, the Bible says you can take prisoners of war and take women as plunder. You know who says that? It's Skylar Fiction. We all know about him.
Right, but what does the ancient Near Eastern scholarship say about these passages?
Right.
Not going to read those.
No.
Not going to. Will you get a citation from Skylar on this? No.
Nope. So here's the passage that people get their panties in a bundle here. But if the women and little children, the little ones, and the cattle, and that is in the city, even all the spoil thereof, thou shalt take unto thyself, and thou shalt eat the spoil of thine enemies, which the Lord thy God has given thee. Now, it looks like if you read this prima facie, you're gonna say, well, yeah, it looks like there's slavery and women are plunder. Well, if you actually do some investigation on what scholars say, this is actually saying vassalage, which goes into the suzerain treaty, like I said, with the vassals surrounding them. And I have a bunch of citations there in my book. I mean, I just don't feel like going through all of them because, for one, we don't have much time. And number two, I just think people should take time to look this stuff up. And instead of me just like splattering it out there on people and just reading it to them. So that is what's going on there. I mean,
So
if you want,
let me just give a couple citations
Sure.
for you, because I will splatter it out there.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you could look at A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law by Dr. Wayman Westbrook. We're talking about social classes. He's saying that legal statuses in his work, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law, on page 35, that, quote, the first historian of ancient law, Sir Henry Maine, observed that the progress of law has been distinguished by gradual dissolution of family dependency and growth of individual obligation in its place. In his celebrated dictum, it was a movement from status to contract. Now, I'm going to stop there. He goes on to say that it's not status from contract, right? That's more of an evolutionary view. Hint, hint, standing for truth. He actually says that instead what you find in the ancient Near Eastern cultures is status alongside contract. So this is why you get quotes like this by, let me give you this one here, by Dr. Wayman Westbrook in his book, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law. Again, same book, pages 35 to 36. Get off! The societies of the ancient Near East were strongly hierarchical in structure with little social mobility. The place of an individual in the hierarchy determined his legal rights. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but I do want to give you, well, I think those are sufficient. Those are some examples of what Praise was talking about. I could give you many more citations.
I want to eat dinner. It's 10 o'clock. Get off of me.
I want to eat dinner too.
Okay,
But-
man, I appreciate all your help. I'm going to wrap this up here.
All right, see you, man. God bless.
I could literally furnish like way more. Praise knows. I shared that.
Yeah, it's just family stuff.
Hey, listen, a happy wife is a happy life, so you probably better get over there and eat some.
Amen. Yeah. I'm going to listen to the rest of the part of the stream, though. Thank you for having me, Standing for Truth, and
Anytime.
I hope this has been edifying to folks.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're always welcome, brother. And thanks for doing this.
Praise. Okay, no worries, brother. Have a good one, and God bless you and your missus. It sounds like you're gonna need it. Praise, could you add Shadow Dancer, and
Yeah.
I don't know, there's other people, whatever you need to add. It's up to you, man.
Yeah,
So I think what we're gonna do is we'll go. For me, it's 1 a.m. here. We'll do an hour on the topic of evolution. If there's anybody in the chat as well, evolutionist, creationist, whoever, and wants to join, let us know. And right now we've got Shadow Dancer. Thanks for joining us. And who's that over there? Anon?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Good having you guys. Shadow Dancer, good.
Hey, non. Hey,
How you doing?
Shadow Dancer.
Yeah, creationist here.
Same.
And we know Shadow Dancer is a creationist as well. Everybody in the chat, if you're not subscribed to Shadow Dancer's channel yet, please do so. She's putting out some great material and some great videos. So keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No problem. No problem. So how's everybody doing tonight?
Blessed.
Doing pretty good, actually.
Good, good. I hope everybody is staying safe. So Shadow Dancer, are you doing a debate soon with
Any topics
With
that you want to
John.
bring up?
Or yeah, or is that supposed to be a secret? Or maybe I just ruined it.
No, I don't think so. I looked on Modern Day Debate, and it doesn't show that the debate is coming up. So I'll have to ask John what's going on with that.
Okay. Yeah, we love modern day debate because we know that a lot of the atheists and evolutionists watch our debates there. So we like to expose their philosophy for all the triggered atheists to see. Praise, you know what's up.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen it. So
Well, it's so funny reading these atheist comments, and I'm sure you all notice as well. Like you'll be in a debate or a discussion, or you've made a video, maybe 100 videos, debunking or addressing a specific question or argument, and then they'll either comment that exact same thing that's been answered, 300 times, or in the Q&A section ask that exact same question. Like I know with mitochondrial Eve, for example, and just a lot of genetic related lines of evidence that we use, they just ask the same things over and over again. Like I think with some of these evolutionists, it's in one ear and out the other. Do you guys find the same thing?
absolutely, yes. I saw it over and over again on your debate with David. They kept asking for, the same things over and over again. Where's his documents? I was like, he's showing documents right now. Like, what more do you want? But it just comes down to, have you guys seen that movie, The Case for Christ?
Yeah, isn't that the one? Is that the one based on Lee? Is it Lee Strobel?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And it gets to a point where he was interviewing this guy, and he goes, "Well, or no?" He says, "I still need more data." And the guy he was talking to, this professor, was like, "Well, when's going to be enough? You have all of this stuff.
Right.
You went to all these universities, spoke to all these people. When are you going to get enough data before it convinces you?"
And what's
And it's the
amazing,
same thing with these atheists.
exactly. And what's amazing too, the Bible says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So, obviously salvation requires some faith, and God is not obligated to give us any scientific evidence. But yet there's just so much scientific evidence out there that these atheists have no excuse. And that's why oftentimes I'll start a discussion or debate by, asking the evolutionists to honestly look to themselves and ask themselves, what would they expect to find scientifically if the Bible was true? And we all know common sense would tell us that, if the Genesis story is true, we should be able to scientifically find evidence for one female ancestor, one male ancestor of all people on the planet. And yet that's exactly what we find. And the evolutionists always harp on, observable, empirical data, testable predictions, for example. And
I love that one.
And we use just that same thing. I mean, Jason knows we use the empirical method. We use pedigree-based studies. In my last debate, I showed several papers, secular papers that, take mitochondrial Eve right back to just 6,500 years. And I was asking Matt the other day, I said, even to the atheists that want to reject that, why? It's such a big coincidence that it just so happens to turn out that it's 6,500 years, which is exactly what the dates in the Bible line up to,
Well, what kills me
Yeah.
with their rescuing device, and this one actually just makes me really angry, because they say that creationism, no matter what, is not science. Even though we're showing scientists that have PhDs, I was like, does that make their PhD inept? Like, it's not, and we're showing the empirical, science, and like we're doing exactly what they are doing, but we're coming up with different data because we're not rejecting data, and they are. They're adding in their own stuff. Like when they did the mitochondrial Eve, I was watching Dr. Georgia Purdom from Answers in Genesis,
Yes.
and she was showing how in 1994 they did the mitochondrial Eve without adding in the data from apes.
Right.
And they got 6,500 years. And this was before they started doing the major human genome projects. And they got really confused. And that study got quickly covered up. And then when they get these really weird dates of like 125,000 years, 350,000, they were comparing mitochondrial DNA from apes and humans. And they get inconsistent dates. It's never the same date. But when they didn't add in apes, they got 6,500 years or 6,400 years.
Exactly. The only way that they can get the deep time evolution is they have to assume humans and chimpanzees are related, and they have to assume deep time evolution. Therefore, because the observable mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA is too fast for them, so just pedigree-based studies where we can measure the mutations takes us right back to one female ancestor 6,500 years ago. But they'll say, yeah, okay, but you're like, for example, when I debated Erica, she said, yeah, but you're assuming mutation rates are constant. But yet somebody like Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, a Harvard graduate, he's got a PhD in cell biology, he's taking the data from pedigree-based studies and the known mutation rate, and he's making predictions, very precise predictions on African people groups, for example, the Khoisan peoples, whose mutation rate has not been measured yet. So we actually have testable predictions that flow from the known observed mutation rate. But then you'll ask the evolutionists to make those predictions, and yet they can't, because they have to assume a mutation rate that is unrealistic, that is 20 times slower than the observed mutation rate. Because remember, they have to stretch that those mitochondrial DNA differences back 200,000 years ago, and they can only do that by assuming deep time evolution. So they'll look to archaeology, they'll look to the geological and the fossil record, for example, but they're not actually using the observed data, and that's why they can't make testable predictions. So great point that you made, Shadow Dancer, is they accuse us of not doing science, but yet we're the ones who are actually doing the science and asking them to also do the science and make a testable prediction, and they can't, and they admit that they can't. So
Well, and it's funny too, because like when I was seeing that in the chat, so I have this book called Christian Apologetics by Douglas Gruthis. I'm not really sure how to pronounce his last name. But he's a professor of philosophy actually out here in Denver. And he wrote in his book that a socialist named sociologist, my apologies, Rodney Stark, claims that the medieval Christian world provided a wellspring of intellectual resources for the development of science, technology, and commerce. He argues that the latter achievements of the scientific revolution were not the result of an eruption of secular thinking, but the culmination of many centuries of systematic progress by medieval scholastics, sustained by that uniquely Christian 20th century invention, the university. This development was rooted in the Christian belief that nature is rationally knowable and should be investigated and used for the common good and the glory of God. I thought that was such a great way to put it. Like, God never told us not to go and investigate nature. In fact, when he said to know him with our mind as well, he meant to go and look at nature. Look what he did. He's not going to reveal all of it to us.
Great point and great quote. It just so happens to turn out that when we do look at nature and do science, it confirms not only God, but the God of the Bible. So it's amazing. We as creationists, we love science. And the more we study science, the more it confirms and strengthens our faith.
But of course, they don't want to hear quotes like this because they still think that, we're absolutely divorcing science and the Bible. It's of course a fallacy. And they're trying to push, and I feel so bad for these kids in my college because they're basically telling them, like, well, if you believe in the Bible, then you can't believe in science.
Right, exactly.
And it's such a horrible rescue device. I don't know if it's really sure if that's considered a rescue device, and these kids aren't taught to think in logical arguments and fallacies and stuff. And I feel really bad for them because they feel like they have to give up one or the other, because if they believe the Bible, then they're not rational. They just believe in a myth. And those that are rational believe in science.
And what's funny is they will, like in these textbooks in grade schools and high schools, for example, where they are looking to indoctrinate the kids, they're using, and we've all been there, I haven't always been a creationist, but it's the same argument that they've always used, whether it's in homology, for example, or so-called vestigial organs, just all these different lies that are found in the textbook, but yet they'll never see the other side. So if you don't see the other side, you're just going to blindly, unfortunately, as a kid, they're just going to believe what they're taught, even though there are refutations and there is an alternative model that's even stronger than the one that they're being crammed with and indoctrinated with. So it is it is sad for those that don't see the other side. And oftentimes we do see the other side 20 years later. Sometimes, like a lot of the evolutionists we debate or we just have discussions with, not that it's too late for them, but they've been so heavily indoctrinated that it's hard to even get them to consider an alternative worldview.
Oh,
It was pretty.
absolutely. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's pretty ironic because, I told one atheist the other day that he was literally swimming in evidence that he chose to ignore, and pretty much every aspect of creation shows evidence of design, and even some of the more honest atheist scientists will admit that the universe appears to be designed. And I always say, well, maybe that is because it is designed. And so I ended up telling this guy, well, you got enough evidence already at your disposal, and any further evidence you would just dismiss anyways.
Exactly. Because oftentimes when you ask them to hypothetically ask themselves what would they seriously expect to find in science if a literal interpretation of Genesis was true. And yet everything that we do find in science is exactly what we would expect to find. Even with mitochondrial Eve, like we were talking about earlier, there was every single possibility in the world that we would have found in genetics multiple diverse mitochondrial lineages within modern people, and that some or even all of these would be shared with chimpanzees. Yet the fact is we find one mitochondrial DNA line, which is exactly what we'd expect to find if the biblical story in Genesis is true. And the only reason why evolutionists look to archaeology, look to the fossil record, for example, is for that exact reason, because what they found didn't quite match up to their evolutionary story. But to us as young Earth creationists, it matches up perfectly. So the science is on our side. It's an amazing thing.
Well, and I also think that, the indoctrination, what happens is, so they get shown all these pretty pictures and all that kind of stuff when they're in elementary and then high school, and then they're forced to be tested on it. So they're just inundated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they get to college, right, they've not been taught to think. They've been forced to take exam after exam that only gives you 4 answers, and only one is correct. So you're not sitting there writing out a statement and actually defending it, right? And then statements like this came up, and this is just going to kill you guys. This is in my geography class. My professor announced in the class, in Africa right now, elephants are being born without tusks. Isn't that great? We see evolution happening because they're being poached. And I raised my hand and I said, ma'am, I was like, how do they know they're being poached for their ivory or for their tusks? They're dead. And she goes, oh, well, but we just see that it's nature, and and it's telling the elephants and she came up with some really weird thing, and I was going, isn't it still an elephant? And the whole class just jumped on me because they're all sitting there nodding their heads like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And I'm like, it's actually losing information.
Right. Now, to the evolutionists, everything is evidence for evolution, and all we actually see is loss of information. All the genetic change that we see is down, and yet they want us to believe that billions of years ago, some single-celled ancestor, evolved into a multi-celled ancestor, into a fish, amphibian, reptile, bird,
Wouldn't it
mammal,
have to be
multi-man.
asexual too? Like
Pardon?
that one cell would have to be asexual.
Right.
So
Right.
if it's uniform, then shouldn't everything be asexual?
Yeah, it's just all their story is inconsistent and contradictory to all the known observable evidence. And you made a good point with the pictures, especially with kids. They're often, and unfortunately, pictures can manipulate a child, right? So they'll have pictures of all these, some land mammal to whale type evolutionary transition with all these pretty pictures. Even though when you actually look at the history of these pictures, like Pakicetus way back in the day was depicted as some like swimming mammal, and now we know it's just some little tiny, dog mammal looking thing. So pictures can be very persuasive, and it's just more of the indoctrination is what it is.
Oh, absolutely. And they also I loved what Answers in Genesis did about showing pictures to kids of like the ark and making it look like a bathtub.
Right.
Reinforcing that it's just it's just something that, these farmers made up 3,500 years ago. And yet they don't show them that the ark has actually been built and tested in multiple countries, not just in America. And, and there are a lot of other things that we can test and show that they work in the Old Testament.
Right.
And we've done it over and over again. But the thing is that they're thinking, oh, well, they're just kids. It's like, no. They're absorbing this stuff. And then when they get to school, they get that famous question, how could Noah fit all the species on the ark? And bam, you see these teenagers just dropping like flies. They're
Right.
leaving the church. They're not getting their answers. And it's only the kids that have actually been taught apologetics that don't get persuaded by this.
Well, because then you're right. You're right. They get those questions thrown at them, and they think of this bathtub-sized ark, and they think about all the millions of species that we see today that would have had to fit on that bathtub-sized ark. So it's all misrepresentation, and it's really just based on a starting point of a straw man argument. And that's what I love about Answers in Genesis and these creation ministries and Ken Hovind, for example. They've got like Ken Hovind's series, Lies in the Textbooks, right? Just going over every single one of these lies that you'll find that these kids were indoctrinated to believe, and just kind of dismantles them all one by one. I know it took me about a year of looking into the other side and the arguments, refuting their typical arguments in homology and transitional forms and vestigial organs, for example. Took me a year. I was stubborn, but eventually I realized that I have been indoctrinated, and thank God I got saved and became a creationist. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I know.
I wasn't paying. Sorry.
Jason, no, go. I've been talking this whole time.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason. Jump in, brother. How are we doing?
No, I wasn't. Oh, good. I wasn't paying much attention, but there's just one thing I wanted to say about the used to get all the time evolutionists jumping on and saying things like show us testable, observable science that to prove your point and all that. They don't say that anymore because they know that they've learned enough to know that the testable, observable rates back our side. So they're not so quick to do that anymore. When I first started, like a few years ago, whatever, just jumping into this and looking into it and arguing with them, they used to say things like that all the time. Give us a citation, show us this, show us that. And now that they're very careful about doing that now. So it's funny.
Well, and for me, I love using their so-called best evidence against them, for example, because their so-called best evidence, quote unquote, like the endogenous retroviruses and these lines of evidence, they're actually support for our model, because we look to DNA function, for example, and yet I can't tell you how many times. I mean, I can name 5 debates right now where I've in the evolutionist opening, they use ERVs, as one of the best lines of evidence for universal common descent. And then the second we get into the discussion portion, I say you realize that these viruses are incredibly important for healthy life processes in the cell, for example. And a lot of them will say, "Oh, I didn't even know that." Or so it's just funny that their number one best evidence for evolution is now support for our position of creation, because like we were saying earlier, the science is on our side, and the more we study the science, especially in genetics, it's just further support for the creation model.
Well, what's funny too is that their whole theory is based on the mythical Luca, last universal common ancestor, and there's not a bit of observable or physical evidence for it.
Right. Good point. Good. Well, and that's the thing, and that's what they'll do to the kids, right? They'll show examples all throughout the textbook of all these microevolutionary variations, and they'll show the wide range of variation in, say, dog breeds, or just general examples of adaptation, for example. And then they'll extrapolate it to say, see, kids, this is why banana plants and humans are related through common ancestry. And it's nothing more than an extrapolation fallacy. And unfortunately, the kids being so young and easily indoctrinated, they just, absorb it all, unfortunately.
Well, and on Neff's channel, about what, like 5 or 6 days ago, we actually had someone in there that was an evolutionist, and he was saying that eventually the speciation is going to get to a point where they can no longer mate, and he mentioned the perfect thing. He said a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, and I said, nope, you're wrong. I was like, they can still have viable offspring, and he goes,
Right.
and I was like, yes, that's how indoctrinated they are, because they believe this speciation is however, like this
But
umbrella term.
if you get you might get goats, and one herd of goats, population of goats on one side of a mountain, one single herd of goats will diverge, and one herd of goats on one side of a mountain won't be able to breed with still interbreed with the goats on the other side. They'll diverge completely, like two different species. But if you look at them, you can see that they're goats. And if you do it via in vitro fertilization, then they'd probably be able to breed.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like that scientist in the 1930s in Germany. He tried to inseminate women with ape DNA, and it didn't take. But
Right.
if you inseminate a Chihuahua with a Great Dane's,
inseminate apes, yeah.
Yeah, but if you inseminate a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, they can have viable offspring, and that's what he
Exactly.
didn't
Yeah, they
know. And
can.
I'm like, you guys, that's like in my class, my geography class, they tried to show that anole lizards, which is ANOLE, show evolution because there's a twig anole, a trunk anole, and a ground anole. And I was actually tested on it. I had to write it out. And how does this show evolution? I was like, it doesn't. It's still lizard.
Well,
She gave me a C on the paper too, and she was like, you have to speak about evolution. And then this other anthropology class, I got a D on one of the responses, and he was like, because you didn't mention evolution. And I'm like, wait, but it was very frustrating.
Yep.
That's terrible.
It's like Holden says, if you're doing a test and it's a question that's relating to evolution, your answer can be, the textbook says this,
Yeah.
the textbook is wrong because of this, and this, because they're not giving the children, the kids, the ability to critical think about these things, right? They're just kind of cramming it down their throat that the universe is billions of years old and all life is related through common ancestry. They won't let them question that, just like the peer review process. I mean, you could question little bits and parts of the theory, but if you actually question the theory itself, you're not going to get published.
Nope, and that's what cracks me up when they talk about, oh, that's not peer reviewed. And it's like, well, what do you mean by
Right.
peer reviewed? This is subjective. And if you
Mhm.
guys have ever seen that movie called The Moses Controversy,
No.
it's absolutely great. He goes into like an hour and 45-minute video, and it's very well done on this new trend. It's actually not new. It's been around for about 120 years that Moses didn't write the first 5 books. And he goes into all the evidence, stuff like that he finds. What's interesting in the beginning of the movie, he goes to these big air quotes here, mainstream scholars,
Right.
and each of them say, oh, no credible scholars would say that Moses wrote the Old Testament. We've got document after document and evidence after evidence, and then he goes to, and they even mention very specifically, no Christian scholars either. And so this guy was like, okay. So he went to some Christian scholars. And this one guy was like, yeah, well, if you're talking about that like elite group of whatever, yeah, he's right about mainstream, but those of us who are not mainstream and still have PhDs in archaeology, paleontology, whatever, there's evidence for Moses writing the Old Testament.
As far as evolution goes, this whole peer review process is just basically a bunch of evolutionists scratching each other's backs. So
Yeah,
what does it matter if there's 10 peers that agree on it when they're all evolutionists and they're godless atheists, and they're going to go with whatever backs their theory?
Exactly. They won't
Exactly.
let anything else through. It's literally just a filter to make sure that their agenda doesn't get changed. And
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
yeah, well, and so you guys will find this kind of interesting. So in the early 1900s, you guys have heard about like the the religious reformations from the past. Like there was one in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and they each have a different basis. There's actually one that was interesting that happened in the early 1900s in America. And it was actually a reformation, a movement to keep creation, 6 days of creation in school. Now, the Scopes trial, what's also known as the monkey trials, happened in 1925, but this movement started just before that, about 20 years before that. And it's interesting because they fought real hard. They won in 1925, and then they lost in 1930. And from then on, we don't know anybody in this generation that hasn't been indoctrinated. It's been 80 years.
Wow. Well, you really know your stuff and your history. That's awesome. Yeah,
I love history.
you are going to be our history expert from now on.
I kind of want to respond what she was saying, though, about the Mosaic authorship. Did you know God told Moses to write this down? I mean, it says it right there that he's the author. What else do you need?
Well, so this is what they say. So I first heard this in my Intro to Eastern Religions class last summer, and he just came out and said that Moses didn't write the Old Testament. I was like, but it actually says in the text that he wrote it, and in the
Right.
New Testament. And as historians, we can look at the Vedic text for the Buddha. Nowhere in it does it say he wrote it. They just claim it's written in his voice, but it's written 300 years after his death, with no transcripts in between, no legends in between. Because I mean, you could actually even say that the Buddha probably didn't exist, and you'd have a viable theory. And so what they say, praise, is not so much that it doesn't matter what the text says. It's the fact that they say that Hebrew is not developed or as a language until 500 BC.
Oh,
Now
I
they've been
gotcha.
proven,
So
yeah.
did they say it's an interpolation or something?
What's interpolation?
Like an addition, like they added it to it or something like that.
So it's called the documentary hypothesis theory, that it was written by 4 or 5
Yeah, it's
different people.
JEPD.
Yep. And that because and they always try to use the end of Deuteronomy, right? With Moses' death. Well, he couldn't have wrote about
That's
his
a
own
hard
death.
one there. That's confusing a little bit. I would say it's probably Joshua, that was writing, but he didn't know what was going on there too much.
Well, and this guy in the video in the Moses controversy, he had a great responses. He goes, "If I wrote a book and I got about 80% done and I have a heart attack and die and and Jason helps me finish it, he's not the author of the entire book just
Right.
because
Good
he
point.
finishes it." And I was like, that's a great response, but they would do anything to undermine the foundation of the Bible.
Right. I completely
Anything
agree.
whatsoever.
And it's like the Bible says, right? The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, neither can he know them, for they are spiritually discerned. And yet we're gonna get this knowledge from unsaved atheists, for example, who apparently know the Bible better than some Christian scholars or better than us, for example. Like they're the ones that are going to tell us that the Bible's corrupt and supposedly the Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the scripture. Like it's crazy to me.
Yeah, well, and like the other thing is that just their rescuing devices on everything, like it every single time. And I told one atheist one time, I was like, your guys' community, religion, none of you agree. I was like, but when I go to my
Right.
creationist community, we disagree on very little. Most of the time, it's some underlying doctrine that's really
Just
doesn't change.
minor things, right?
Exactly. It doesn't change their overall thing of the Bible, And actually, I've noticed out of the creationists that I've met that it actually gets us more in tune with the Bible by believing in a young earth, because then we don't have these millions of years to try to contend with. And, where do we fit this in? Where do we fit this in? Like it just doesn't make any sense. But if you believe in a young earth where it's supernaturally created and God can change rates and conditions in the past, obviously he did with the flood, which is what's screwing them up anyways. And and our community is much more tightly knit when it comes to our theories. Like you can go from creation channel to creation channel and you'll see very little variance.
Exactly. And it flows. A young earth, a young creation flows theologically. You don't have to force fit anything in that maybe you've been indoctrinated with all these things that are science falsely so called, because these are all things that are not observed anyways. And then with things that are observed, like mutation rates, they need to reject because it doesn't fit their their theory. But like you said, Shadow Dancer, that's a good point. Like it would, if you have that starting point from scripture in a young earth, then everything makes sense. Even with the dating methods, they always bring these dating methods up, and I say, guys, these are relative ages, not absolute ages, because all dating methods, even their praised isochron dating, which they say gets rid of all assumptions, it still assumes a history. So it still assumes a history of deep time evolution and assumes away a global flood. But I always say, guys, if radioisotope decay was accelerated, and there's plenty of evidence for it in the rock record, obviously during the Genesis flood, then those radioisotope decay clocks could never be relied upon when they date rocks of millions and billions of years old. Because if decay rates were sped up at the Genesis flood, then these dates, although could be accurate, they're nothing more than just relative ages. And it all makes sense from a biblical starting point, and you don't got to force fit anything into scripture.
Yep, none whatsoever. And it kind of kills me too, because even if you present all that evidence to them, guess what they're going to say? Well, the Bible was written by man, so therefore it's valuable. And I ask them this one question: have you ever heard of Nimrod? And have you ever heard of Nero? Most of the time, they're going to say yes. And we do have archaeological proof of, I think, within a couple generations of Nimrod.
Right.
And I told him, I said, I just mentioned 2 kings 2,000 years apart. That is the entire Bible, actually, from Nimrod to Nero. So I tell him, I was like, you actually only disagree with about 2% of the Bible. Creation and the flood, which only goes to what, like chapter 9, 12 maybe? And Revelation, because it hasn't happened yet. And historically speaking, the Bible is 98% accurate, because we have no history before the flood. We have to rely solely on the Bible. And when I tell them that, it's actually pretty amazing. Some of them will actually step back and be like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, even Alexander the Great
Mind
is mentioned in the
blown.
Book of Daniel. I mean, so if it's that historically accurate, then how come you can't?
Well,
prove the
that's
other
why I
2%?
find 2 Peter 3 so convincing. And believe it or not, it was that scripture almost that convinced me, on top of some of the science. But that scripture, when I first heard it, I thought, this is amazing, because this is what 95% of atheists reject. And it says, in the last days, there's going to be scoffers walking after their own lust, and they're going to reject three things: the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment. And yet the creation and the flood are the 2 things that explain everything we see in geology, for example, in obviously in the solar system, really anything science, and then the coming judgment that they scoff at as well, right? The return of Jesus Christ. So these are especially the flood and the creation, are the 2 things that can explain away all the objections that the atheists bring up, and yet those are the things that they reject.
Right.
So how can they ever see the evidence then? Right. So I thought that was fascinating, because this was written down 2,000 years ago, and yet today, what do we see?
And
This is
Romans 1
exactly what
2,
we're
both of
arguing about.
them.
What does Romans 1:2 say, Praise?
I mean, Romans chapter 1, it talks about people suppressing the natural
Right.
revelation of God. If you look at when you look at the majesty of the heavens, I mean, that's there's something like that's incredibly awesome. Like you would,
Right.
that's not an accident. That's not even logically coherent. So that obviously when you can see the attributes of God when you look up at the heavens. That's in Romans
Right.
1. Yeah.
Right.
Yep, and it goes so far too. Like, I don't know if you guys watched Neff's video, but I talked about how it's they're targeting women in a different way, because they're like, oh, the Bible oppresses you and stuff like that, and in every single scenario, it's a rejection of God. You have to get God out, because those men are just oppressing you. Like this lady in my class, she said, yeah, the only reason we have last names is from the male patriarchy in the Bible. And I was like, what? That's not true. But if they're ill-equipped, if women are ill-equipped, they're getting them on this, because like in this apologetics book, it actually talks about how, okay, God is portrayed as a man, right? Meaning it says he, father, all that kind of stuff. And you guys might already know this, but let's see, it says nevertheless, the Bible uses feminine imagery when it speaks of God as giving birth to Israel and to the Christian. Jesus said he longed to gather rebellious Israel to himself as a mother hen gathers her chicks. And so, but they try to use this against women, like, oh, like Jesus was a man, God is referred to as a man, but he is neither. He's not both. He's not a duality thing. He's neither. Because he says in the beginning, he's like, he can't procreate with himself because it's not, he's God. The idea of man and woman is to be fruitful and multiply, right? And I thought that was actually kind of cool, but these women don't know this. And so they're being led astray because of this. Oh, and I heard this at a writing convention for females. And it was like, and it goes right back to evolution. 10,000 years ago, we were the matriarchy, and men have had it for the past 10,000 years. We need to take it back. And I'm like, oh, wow. They literally dip everything into evolution. Everything.
Yeah, that's a really great point. They're indoctrinated to think of the Bible as anti-women, or just like Praise was talking about earlier, they're trained or indoctrinated to think that the Bible is pro-slavery and all of these horrible, horrible things. And yet, for the ones that don't see the other side, it's a real shame because they're going to go on believing them.
Yeah,
Right, and
absolutely. And
genocide and all that other stuff that they don't understand.
yeah, it's actually kind of funny, guys. I love National Geographic, and there's a group of historians. I wanted to prove that Herod was not the bad guy from the Bible. Basically, in a way, just a stab at the Bible. Guess what they found out? He was a murderer, he was a liar, and when he died, his scribe, the way it was written was like his scribe was like, ha ha ha, this guy died horribly. He was bleeding from every orifice. He had fluid coming from everywhere. He had every known like disease from a horrible, horrible lifestyle. And they kind of concluded that the more likely the Bible was probably right. And I was like, duh, because it hasn't been wrong on anything else.
Who is this again?
It was just a National Geographic.
Oh, wow.
Article.
So SFT said he lost connection, so he'll come right back.
Cool.
So, is there any like questions anyone has? Because we were talking about slavery earlier. Is there any like difficult things you don't understand, or?
No, but I really appreciated that because it was very interesting.
Yeah, my pleasure. Hopefully, you can inform people some of this stuff out there that usually many people just are not knowledgeable about, and I think it's pertinent to understand this stuff, especially when you have accusers of God out there.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that brought up, the slavery thing and killing the babies and stuff like that. That they always go for that first, and God is a
Yep.
psychopath and stuff like that.
Yep.
I do have a comment, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Anon, you actually asked me this, and I will try to find this video from Cross Examined, but Frank Turk talks about it. And he says, and he put it in a great way. He said, in the Old Testament, there was God gave them laws for everything: civil laws, criminal laws, and then moral laws, which is the 10 Commandments. Well, the 10 Commandments spans the entire Bible, but not those criminal and civil laws. Those were specifically to keep Israel different from the rest. And I thought that was a really great point, because that's the old covenant and the new covenant is Jesus. So we don't
Right.
have to follow those civil and criminal laws. Yeah, just like what you said, and you brought up a lot of great points, and very much appreciate all the research that you did into that.
Yeah, my pleasure. And yeah, a lot of people should think about that. If were these laws legislative in the first place, were they prescriptive? In ancient Near East scholars, I mean, according to their commentary, it's not legislative. The ones that are if-then laws, the hypothetical laws, those are not legislative.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And the other thing is that people will take anything out of the Bible that they can.
Yeah.
And you can literally support any doctrine you want from the Bible if you take it out of context.
Oh yeah, you can make it read anything you want it to be if you want to twist and manipulate it. And that's what people like Dillahunty and these other fanatical atheists like to do. And when they do that, they make it their own Bible. It doesn't become the Holy Bible anymore. It becomes their own Bible. Their own translation of it.
Oh, absolutely. And, like I get approached on campus all the time by these weirdo people that pull certain things out, like they say we should worship Mother Earth, that there's evolution is proof in Genesis.
Oh, God.
Oh, we can kill babies, we can do this, we can enslave women. And all because they can take this stuff out of the Old Testament, take it out of context, and then those that are not don't know real well how the Bible or have not read the Bible, they get persuaded by this stuff so easily.
Ignorance
And
can be a problem. Yeah.
oh, absolutely, and it can lead them down paths that they would have not gone on before if they had read the Old Testament and had some help, family.
Research. I think it comes down to laziness too, but they take a prima facie attitude with it, and that's not going to be it's not a good outlook to do that.
Yep,
They were made
absolutely
an
agree.
example of. They were made an example of by God. Those people that God ordered wiped out, and this is the truth, were throwing their firstborn, getting a woman to throw her firstborn child into the arms of a red hot statue called Molech, well, worshipping to
Yeah.
Satan, basically. And the woman would have to stand there while her baby burnt to death, screaming to death in the arms of the statue while they blew trumpets to drown out its sound and stuff like that. And if she showed any remorse for throwing her firstborn onto the red hot metal statue's arms, then she was put to death as well. So she had to be completely happy about it through the whole thing. And and they were the sort of people that God ordered wiped out, and that they were made an example of. So, God could have just snapped his fingers and they'd be gone, but they were made an example of, and they were told to be made an example of, and better the kids die and go to heaven, because I believe young children that don't understand they need a savior, they go to heaven by default. So better those young children get put to death and go to heaven, and rather than grow up and just be evil and have more children and so on and be made an example of, because we've found archaeological evidence to support a lot of these things that they say in the past where there was no evidence for, that there's a lot of evidence for now, like Jericho, I think, is one of them. Yeah, I mean, they've got a lot of evidence now, archaeological evidence they're digging up all the time to support the Old and New Testament.
Well,
Yep.
and the problem is, Jason, is that they're not going to believe any of this until they get the Holy Spirit, because all they're going to do is just cherry pick the information because they are offended by Christianity. They hate Christianity, and they don't want anything to do with God,
Oh yeah, I know.
So they're going to pull that stuff out, like, oh, this is the God of death and whatever. And it's like, well, first of all, he created us, so he could take us out if he wants to. I mean,
Yeah, well, they were meant to be made an example of, and it was something that they had to do for that time and that commandment, and God would give them a commandment to do that. It wasn't for all time. Those commandments weren't for all time for Jews to go out and just slaughter, all non-Jews at the moment they come across them, sort of thing. So, is the way that they're trying to make it out to be. It's not. There's a difference between other religions where the commandments are open-ended and for all time, whereas a lot of those commandments in the Bible were for that time only, in those particular terms when God gave out a commandment. So, so they weren't open-ended.
that's actually a great
Yeah, that's
point.
good. And besides all those excellent points, who is to tell God what He's to do with His creation? He's the boss. He made everything. He's the one with all the information.
And
Yeah.
he's also
Well,
our moral standard too, so if he judges us sinful and takes us out, I mean, he is the ultimate bar that we have to try to reach, and he is without sin. In fact, I think it says in the Bible the only thing God can't do is sin.
True.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I suppose that's like in the beginning, when God called everything good, there couldn't have been blood in the ground crying out from the ground. There couldn't have been all those things, and God called it good. So that's true. I heard that the other day, and that's true. Couldn't have been death as an enemy, blood crying out from the ground, all these bad things, and God's calling it good, so there couldn't have been death before sin.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was funny when I was in that class, 100,000 Years of War. Some of they're trying to figure out where violence comes from, right? And they got to figure it out from an evolutionary perspective. None of their data made any sense. Like, and they even
Well, it's just
admitted
that
this.
I want your stuff is better than mine. I'm just going to take it, and that's the way it is.
No, they think it's a warrior gene. Actually, there's 4 theories, but the main one, the most prevalent one that they were really trying to find is that
It's
it's
called
in our genome
being
and that
greedy.
huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so then they did a test where they tested people. Oh gosh, this thing's going nuts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyways, where they actually tried to test this gene theory, right? That there was some kind of warrior gene. And it came out that those that they thought had the warrior gene had a 60% likelihood of being violent or something like that. And then they tested people that didn't have it and came with the same result. So therefore their theory was just completely trash.
Yeah.
And then they tried to go to monkeys, of course, and they always compare us to chimps, bonobos, and gorillas. And
Yeah, like I'm gonna attack you and rip your face off and eat it just because I'm upset today. Yeah, I can see that. It looks a lot. Humans and gorillas have a lot in common. I mean, chimpanzees, like things like that. I mean, there's a chimp that was with its master for so many 20 years or something, and a long time anyway. And it gave it away, and then it went back, and the chimp was really dirty. That it abandoned. The chimp had been abandoned by this person, so the chimp attacked it and ate its face off and ate a face.
Yummy.
Chimps don't have a they don't have they
Conscience.
don't think like us. They got a different shaped brain. For them to evolve into something from for us to evolve from that into what we are, with all the mechanisms in our brain and what's lacking in their brains, and how the differences are just amazing. It's immense. It's huge. The massive differences and changes it would take forever for it to evolve at current rates, and that's why they hate the current rates, the current mutation rates, because it blows their little paradigm out of the water. So they have to make up a fairy tale about it, how it was different in the past. So anyway, I'll leave it on to you, Stand for Truth.
Yeah, you're right. It would be impossible for them to account for all those differences, even according to their own time scale of I think 6 million years or so. I think they've even pushed it back, some of them, to like 15 million years since the split, because of all the contradictory data. Which is funny. They'll say that chimps and humans share 98 to 99% similarity, but yeah, we share 98 to 99% of our genetics with chimps, but only if we ignore 18% and 25% of our own DNA. So, and even if it was just 2% different, I mean, that's still millions and millions of DNA differences that separate us and chimps that they would have to account for in just 6 million years. So
No way.
it's philosophy,
There's
and the
no
thing
way.
is, though,
Yeah, it's fairy tales, because with that amount of time, with the observed mutation rate, it would take like 90 billion years or something ridiculous like that. So for the change, even if you give them, the low end of the scale, or the high end, or whatever you want to call it, you give it to them, it's still the change for the times and things. That's why they have to make up mutation rates.
Exactly. Unrealistic mutation rates just to force fit it into the data. Like if you include, Jason, the single letter differences, the chunk differences, and the big chunks that are missing on either side with the chimp and the human, you only get about 88 or maybe 88 or 89% similarity, for example. So in that 88 or 89% similarity, you can find the so-called 95 to 98% identity, but that's only if you ignore, the other 12%, for example, of those things that actually don't align. So if when you include everything, you're upwards of around 300 million DNA differences. Now that's a lot of DNA differences to account for in just 6 million years. And then they like to complain about that, right? Gutsy Gibbon and Aaron Ron, and Steve McRae, for example. So even if you just gave them, for sake of argument, the 98% similarity, that's still in the millions of DNA differences that they have to account for. So either way, it's impossible.
Well, and then just look at the history of what they say our Earth went through, right? An impacting moon that would have destroyed everything on our planet. And
Right.
then you've got multiple catastrophes that they say killed everything, including the bacteria. So evolution had to start over and over again in 3 billion years. And then they're like, well, it took 3 billion years for the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago. And it's like, well, wait, but you're saying that an object, a celestial object, 70% the size of our Earth crashed into us or clipped us 3.5 billion years ago, because it can't be too soon, because otherwise then it'd be too much lava, right? And it can't be too late because they have to have plankton creating the atmosphere. But yet it would have caught. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And I always like to ask them too, like, okay, let's say I take your theory, I give you that, right? The moon crashed into the Earth. Now we have the moon. Where's all the debris? They'll be like, oh, well, gravity pushed it away. Okay, then where did Saturn's rings come from? Do you know what their answer is to that?
Well, what's their answer?
A collision. They say that an
Right,
asteroid
you're right.
hit a moon on the outside of Saturn and created its rings. And I'm going, well, so an object that's 70% our size hit us and we have no rings? Like, now you're just being contradicting. Oh, they hate it when I bring that up.
Oh yeah, because it's all a story, and yet when you start to look at the details of the story, you see just how inconsistent and contradictory it is.
Yeah, and then they can't even have life forming. So it's like you can give them the 90 million years, but then you still got all these catastrophes in there. It's going to restart it. So how old is the universe again? Is it trillions of years old?
Right. It's true. Even though there's absolutely no evidence for universal common descent, or the evidence that they do use is easily refuted or better explained by the creation model, they have no evidence for solar system evolution, stellar evolution, cosmic evolution. There's all these different problems. There's all these different stories. And of course, there's no evidence for abiogenesis and chemical evolution. And most atheists will just admit that. There's only a select few that'll spend an hour debating something so ridiculous as the origin of life scenario. I mean, there's absolutely zero evidence for such a thing.
You mean you don't believe in fish to fishermen?
Right.
Nor lifeless chemicals to life type, evolution. And I find it amazing because DNA, for example, is extremely fragile. It's an extremely fragile molecule as it's subject to oxidation. So oxygen alone destroys it. Water destroys it. These strands break, and this DNA system, this information system, it's not a system that's actually maintainable without a maintenance system. So I always ask, what came first, DNA or the ability to maintain the DNA, which is encoded in the DNA? Do you not see the chicken and egg problems that abound? I mean, they're unanswerable problems. And then all you'll get in a debate or discussion on this topic is stories, drawing boards, philosophy. Like I was listening to a couple atheists earlier on Speed of Sound's channel. It was Speed of Sound, Immutable Destiny, and Salvador. And I think it was like 10 minutes straight. They were just going over, well, maybe this happened billions of years ago, or maybe this happened, or this is how oxygen wasn't a factor. And it's like, Do they not get or see
The
that
snake,
it's
yeah.
a story without any actual scientific evidence to support it?
I think this that you know what they just don't care because I see it in my classes with this confirmation bias, right? They just soak this stuff up, and it's like even if they go outside and get a little bit of research, they're still like, no, 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 no. It. I just think that it's. I don't even think it's so much like the ones that debate on your channel standing, but they just don't want to believe.
Right. No, it's amazing. Like, um, the ones that you'll just find on the street, not the hardcore ones that will debate on the channel, generally, like evolutionists or atheists that I work with, for example, they don't spend too much time on it. And you can use the most basic arguments that say somebody like even Kent would use, like, dogs produce dogs. That doesn't mean that dogs today came from some non-dog long ago and far away. Like, give me an example of this, and typically that throws them off, just something like that, to about 95% of the evolutionists. And then the hardcore ones that we get, we'll get a little bit more
In depth.
technical with them. But the point is, most of them are just, they don't really think about it. They're not all as militant as your Aaron Ra's of the world.
Yeah, that's very true. And the other thing is that it's that one thing over again, how much data before you actually believe, it's nope, I don't believe. Nope, I don't believe. Like, they always try to throw at us the what was that lady's name that found the tissue that became famous here in the United States? Dr. Mary Schweitzer.
Right.
She immediately had to retract what she found in some scientific fashion because we have the original videos from when she found it. And she claims it had a smell. It was spongy. It was not something that was mineralized. Well, they keep trying to use this because she got hit so hard by her own community that she had to come back and they keep trying to throw this out there. They're like, no, 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 look, look, look.
It's like they say about the horn. Mark Armitage explained about the horn, that the buffalo horn and the triceratops horn are two different things, are built in two different ways. So, and they seem to miss that point. It's like they miss the point on a lot of things.
Well, the thing is, they have to explain that evidence away as well. And it's not just Mary Schweitzer. It's like Mark Armitage was saying, like, this is now the rule that so many tissues and these biomolecules, they actually are found, they remain in fossils that are apparently, according to the evolutionists, millions of years old, when in fact, once again, real empirical science in chemistry demonstrates that not only are these biomolecules found, but they could not have survived that long. And that includes collagen, blood vessels, vessels from dinosaur bones. What else? Muscle tissue, ligaments, DNA, living bacteria. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And they want to come up with, I always say it, rescue devices. What can explain how these, and they'll point out like, oh, Mary Schweitzer, she's still an evolutionist. Yeah, of course, she still holds to evolution, but that's not actually an argument. And I was debating James Downard on that topic, and that was pretty much his argument, that we're misrepresenting her because she's still an evolutionist, But that's not really a big surprise if that's the worldview she held to anyways. But how do you actually explain the observation that these tissues and biomolecules still remain in these fossils? That's another major problem that they face.
Well, and she's not the only one either. Like, she's not the first one. There was actually soft tissue discovered in China in 2005. That was before her discovery in 2009.
And there's proteins that they've found that that don't even belong to bacteria, so they can't say that the bacteria left them or it's bacterial contamination, because the proteins that they found don't even exist in bacteria. Two of them, I can't remember which ones.
Well, I think Mary Schweitzer suggested that iron was able to act as a preservative over millions of years by cross-linking the soft tissue proteins to preserve its its structural integrity. But from my understanding, it's only been shown that hemoglobin can be preserved for, I believe it's up to 2 years, maybe a little bit more. And even that is a highly concentrated iron solution that wouldn't be expected to be found in the natural environment of these
Not unless
fossils.
they've got machines that spin things at very high speed and separate out different like blood clotting agents and all sorts of stuff like that. No. And scientists and stuff like that in nature, then no, they wouldn't find that in nature. Like she did with that ostrich blood. There was a lot of processes to that would never ever happen in nature in a million years, and it really solved nothing anyway. So.
No, it didn't. And that's just one of the many lines of evidence that we can even use to prove a young Earth. I mean, a huge one that I've never found a good answer to. And I don't know, maybe you guys know what the evolutionist counter to diamonds are. Like, we know diamonds are the hardest substance on Earth. And so its interior should be extremely resistant to contamination, because we know a lot of their rescue devices are, it was contaminated with carbon. But in the case of diamonds, it's the hardest.
And another thing when they say about carbon-14 contamination, you got to remember at any one time on the whole Earth, there's only about 1 or 2 kilos, I think, or 1 kilo or something like that of carbon-14 at any one time on the whole planet. So what happens is, as the animal eats, it takes up the carbon-14 that living things take in, and then it slowly accumulates. So for carbon-14 contamination to be in the concentrations that it would be there, I don't think it's going to happen naturally from just, say, washing down with a bit of minerals, washing it down into the rock. Maybe, I don't know, but
well, the thing is,
it could be,
and that's the thing. So. And that's a great point.
Even situations,
I'll often say, even for sake of argument, if you just gave them that rescue device, they have no answer for why the carbon-14 would be found in diamonds, because of, I guess, the hardness of it that's found in the Earth. So technically, any carbon-14 found in diamonds would be there since the beginning. And diamonds, they require very high pressure to form. And this pressure can only be found deep below the surface of the Earth. So I'm not sure how. So obviously they can't look to contamination to explain why carbon-14 is found in diamonds. Do you know, like, if you guys were to just play devil's advocate, what is the evolutionist? How do they respond to that?
Doesn't look old.
Yes, probably.
Yeah, so I'm not even really sure if they've even got a rescue device for that one, but
I've never even seen them respond to that.
I have, but it was the Jason Lyle and Hugh Ross. They do talk about it, and I just can't remember what he says, because Jason Lyle brings that up about diamonds, and Hugh Ross does have a response, but I don't remember what it was.
Right,
So,
and that was a really good debate.
yeah, that was an awesome debate.
I'll have to, I'm kind of curious, because I always like hearing.
You clearly see that he was an evolutionist, even though he says he believes in the Bible.
Oh, right. And his, and the thing about, like, Fuzz Rana, I'm saying that right? Hugh Ross, Reasons to Believe, their position, because I don't believe they accept universal common ancestry, but because they don't accept, I'm not sure if they accept a literal Adam and Eve just 6,500 years ago or so, but they have a really weird position on the so-called hominoids, like Neanderthals and Erectus. Like, I remember when Hugh Ross debated Hovind years ago, 20 years ago, he said Neanderthals weren't human. They have really odd positions on the so-called hominids. While we believe Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Heidelbergensis, all of these so-called, pre-humans, we believe they were all just humans. But your old Earth creationists like Hugh Ross, they don't. They've got a really weird. I noticed Dr. Joshua Swamidass too. He's got a new book called, I think, the Genealogical Adam and Eve. He'll say that, like, Neanderthals are not human as well. Are you guys familiar with that?
Not that one, but I can actually tell you at least Hugh Ross's stance on it, because I watched a video with Jason Lyle, Ken Ham against Walter Kaiser and Hugh Ross.
Yes.
And actually, it was that 4-hour video, right? So I can tell you what their stance is. They don't believe that it was a universal flood. They believe that Adam was created 90,000 years ago, and not a little bit in the form that he is now, but like what they're finding in the fossil record, because they have to put that in somehow. They also believe that the animals, that because Christ only came to die for humans, that there are no underlying doctrinal problems if animals are eating themselves before Adam and Eve sinned.
Right.
And they also believe that there was, where they fit in their millions of years, is that on day 4 in Genesis, that's when they say the way that they bring it out or whatever, is that's when a day was created. So therefore the days prior, and they put constraints on God too. They say, because God was the light in the beginning and then he replaced it with another light. So
Yes.
yeah, and so what we would think is that God just provided a light, like an omnipotent light, right? No, they believe that there was a sun, that there was another sun.
A translucent light, yeah.
Yeah, they believe it was another sun, and their response is that there's no way God could have just after the earth is formed and everything suddenly put in the sun, because it would violate all these laws. And I'm going, this is a supernatural creation. God can
Yeah.
do whatever he wants, because they're
Oh,
talking
especially
gravity.
during the creation event or the creation week.
Oh yeah, none of
That's
those
not
laws
like
were even
today.
none of those laws were even in play. But they
Exactly.
believed in uniformitarianism and naturalism, that basically God was these laws, right? And he can't stop these laws. And yet, but they say at the flood he did. Like the water was standing straight up over the mountains, because they don't believe that it was a global flood. And they also don't believe God created dinosaurs.
I think they even believe in like different episodes of special creation to
Yes.
fill in different eras of, and that's the thing, like their science and theology are kind of, because they're trying to force fit some of these things into, I guess, into their theology. It's just weird. I mean, to say that the Neanderthals and a lot of these, I guess as the evolutionists would say, hominoids are not human, that's a really tough position to hold to. And yeah, they would have to believe in a local flood because they accept the geological record of time. So if they believed in a global flood, they would have to admit that, the majority of the geological column, the fossils found in them, were a result of the flood, and they can't do that. So it just,
And they
if
pull
you
to a
actually,
really weird view too, because they pull stuff out of like Psalms like 104, I think it is, or 103. And they try to say, look, like there's all this stuff, and it's like, no, you need to read the entire chapter. I think they do. But the thing is that they don't want to be ridiculed by the scientific community. So what do?
right.
They're like, oh yeah, we can agree with part of the science. They don't believe some of the hominids, because they have to believe in something of the Bible, because otherwise all Christians are going to completely reject them.
Yeah,
But they make a hodgepodge of it,
right.
and
Yeah, exactly.
you know,
It's such an awkward model, and they're also not up to date on our literature too, because even with the dating methods, you can just read one or two technical papers or read some work by Andrew Snelling, for example, like the catastrophic plate tectonics model that we defend. It produces new oceanic crust replacing the old one, and this new oceanic crust would show the same age through isochron dating. I always go directly for the jugular and go isochron dating, because that's what they typically say is their best dating method. But it would show the same age even through that type of dating method, since it formed all at the same time during the during the flood. So it's just a shame. It's a shame that them had reasons to believe that they would have to, I guess, accept that geological record when they don't really have to. I just noticed. Brother Salvador, how you doing?
Yeah, wow, what a pleasure to have him.
Thanks for.
I just finished up with about 2 hours ago with Mike and Immutable Destiny. So,
right. Yeah, I was giving you a compliment because you were, and then you just happened to be in the chat. But I was saying that you were doing a great job showing the implausibility of abiogenesis, and just being an observer and listening to the discussion, which was really good and enjoyable. I was out shopping and I had to wait in line for 45 minutes, so I tuned in. And your position, your arguments were great, Sal. And all I seen, and nothing against them, they were respectful too, but all I really seen, if I just break it down, was a lot of storytelling, or maybe this happened, or it could have been this way, but nothing that was actually empirical. So I commend you for that. Great job.
Well, that's amazing. I really wasn't trying to argue. I was actually trying to not get into a debate. I needed to get some chemistry knowledge, and they're very, very generous. Maybe you may wonder why I seem to be on friendly terms with atheists. I have their temperament, and then also a lot of the people that gave me the training to be a creationist were not creationists.
Good point.
My professor of actually, one of the sweetest guys on the planet. He was an evolutionary biologist. He was my professor. I learned evolutionary biology from him. Just a real sweet guy. So, I mean, it may shock people that I seem to be on such friendly terms with the opposition, but unless they're hating on me, I really do try to make an effort to be on good terms with them. There's some of your guests there I couldn't ever deal with. I don't think I
know which ones you're.
I don't think I could ever debate James Downward. Oh my goodness! I'd just be turning red the whole time.
I was just going to mention James Downward. Yeah, he's a difficult one to.
You got to show citation, huh?
Well, I think it's an effective approach, Sal, because sometimes just, for example, you'll make a point, or you will provide some science, and even just not being combative, just letting, say, the atheist or even the theistic evolutionists just kind of make their point and give their thoughts, even if it's for a couple minutes straight. Oftentimes, an objective viewer can see what they're saying is really not supported by the science. And I find that especially true in conversations regarding abiogenesis. So I found that to be true today, listening to your conversation, that you'd make some really good points. And even if they were to talk for a few minutes straight, if it's nothing but, I always say storytelling, and the evolutionists hate it, but sorry, that's pretty much what they do a lot of. And we're not really interested in storyboards. We're interested in the actual data and evidence. So,
well, one reason I spend time with them is actually, unlike some young Earth creationists, I actually, by the way, I think Dr. Sanford wouldn't mind me sharing this, because I spoke with him this afternoon, and I almost tried to get him to do a little greeting to the Standing for Truth channel, but I just couldn't get around to it.
No problem.
That would be awesome.
And he and I both feel that the evolutionists have made a very compelling case. It doesn't mean that it's right, but I think we sometimes estimate how deceptive something can be and still be very, very persuasive, even if the facts don't line up. And he and I are kind of the opinion, you don't underestimate how persuasive it can be. And that's also partly by design. It says in Proverbs 25:2, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, it's the glory of kings to search it out. And then Jesus himself said, I praise you, Father, that you've concealed these things from the wise and the learned. Yeah, you've done a really good job of that.
It's too true.
So I try to listen carefully to their arguments, because the reason I'm concerned is I deal with a lot of Christians that are just about on the edge, especially the science students that go off. And I'm not just like, I had the same problems that you did, because even though there are differences between chimps and humans, when I'm doing gene browsing, some of the genes I study, I'm just like, oh Lord, this is kind of tough. You made that gene 100% identical in a human as it is in a man. And I had to really work through that. I mean, this is so, I know we laugh and we giggle at how badly some of their stuff is, but sometimes the Lord doesn't make it necessarily easy to see the truth.
Right.
He's going to make the people that'll find the truth are the ones that are going to dig and maybe dig really hard. And it took many years before I could start to have satisfying answers where I could feel this is good. I mean, so I just wanted to explain that. I have a certain temperament. I'm not quite too combative with the other side, unless it's someone like James. Oh my goodness, I think I'd probably lose it. You get a different side of me that's not very nice.
Well, you know,
Well,
Salvador, Bill Morgan did the same thing with who was it that he debated? Forgot his name.
Mark
Mark.
Drysdale.
And he did great. You know, he was very kind, very nice, and honestly, I think that's probably one of the best approaches.
It is
because
effective.
It is very effective. Like I was talking to this guy at my college, and we sat on a bench, drank some tea, and for 2 hours we just talked. We didn't debate and argue. We just back and forth, you know. And at the end, he goes, "So, am I going to go to hell?" And I was like, "Let me tell you my favorite scripture, John 3:17." I said, "For God sent his son not in the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." I didn't answer him whether he's going to go to hell or not. And I said, "This is your choice." And he goes, "Okay, I'm gonna look into this." And I was like, "Okay, there you go." You know, I don't know what came of it. I haven't seen him in a year, you know, but still, it was all because I was polite, kind, and you know, and he was being the same way too. Because I agree with you, Salvador. Like if they start to go off the deep end, you know, I'll probably lose my temper.
Exactly. Yeah. We can adapt if we have to.
I wanted to say one thing. I nearly left the Christian faith 20 years ago. One thing, amazingly, and I totally will not recommend this to anyone else. You have to be sort of crazy to do it. But I hung out with the atheists, and for a while it was great because I said I love all their skeptical questions, and I love being in an environment where I could finally just be open and say I have doubts or I don't believe this or that. But they did a lot, you know. Then I said the one question I would pose to them, I said, "Well, what do you live for? I mean, how does atheism make your life more meaningful?" And that's when they would lock up. I'm just like, "Well, guys, you know, I think I'm going to just go back to Christianity with what little mustard seed of faith I have." Because you have nothing. I mean, nothing personal, guys, but you have nothing to offer me. I mean, except
Right.
you know,
True.
some nice conversation and some skepticism, which I appreciate, but you can't give me eternal life. Where else
Right.
will I go? You know,
Well, they have nothing eternal of eternal worth to offer you. And I wanted to touch on something you said, Sal, that I really agreed with, that we never want to underestimate our opponent. You know, we never want to underestimate their side. Just like the Bible says in Proverbs, you know, pride goeth before destruction. So the moment we think we're better than them, or you know, that there's no strength at all to their position, you know, just like the Bible said, that's when, you know, pride goeth before destruction. Because like you said, a lot of the lines of evidence, a lot of the science, it is convincing to them. You know, and to me, even years ago, when I really got into studying this in depth, you know, some of the genetic evidence, just like you said, with genomic comparisons with, you know, the chimpanzees and the humans, and a lot of these, you know, endogenous retroviruses and the nested hierarchies in DNA and things like this. Even some of the fossil records, you know, the Neanderthals and all your different hominoids and things like this. Like this is convincing to the evolutionists, and therefore I believe we need to have sound arguments or sound alternatives as well. So that's why I'm a huge advocate for always staying up to date on the most current literature regarding our side, you know, the creationist side, the most current and up-to-date arguments that we have. You know, that's why I always highly recommend Contested Bones. I think that's a phenomenal piece of work that should be studied, you know, in this kind of conflict. So, you know, that's my position. I don't think we should ever underestimate our opponents. That's for sure.
I had the privilege of contributing a couple pages to that book. So, and there's so much to read. I haven't even gotten around to finishing it because there's so much now.
Oh, it's crazy. I know.
I'll tell you, I just wanted to say one thing about common descent. And I asked, you know, they keep talking about all these protein phylogenies.
Right.
I'm just going to give you this data point because it just crushes them. I've asked just about every evolutionist. I said, okay, just take all the genes and proteins out there. Do they descend from a single ancestral gene or protein? all of them will say no. I said, so there's no universal common descent at all in the proteins, at least. You may argue for organisms, but so everything's just like an orphan all the way down. You mean none of them have ancestors? I said, it's plain as day. And I said, you like on Talk Origins website, they said, look at all these hidden Markov models that prove common descent. Well, it just turned out they didn't read some of the other papers that said we can't use the hidden Markov models on all proteins because they don't resolve to a common ancestor. Just like, oh, gee, talk about cherry picking. So, I wanted to say, so were you?
That's a great, yeah.
Yeah. So are you saying that all the protein major families just sort of kind of like had no ancestor? You know what that means? And they just brushed it off and said, it's plain as day. You're invoking special creation. So, it's not very different from special creation because you can't use random. The thing is, if you don't have a common ancestor for all these major protein families, natural selection and mutation is not going to explain their origin. But there's been even some more incredible things that we're just starting to scratch the surface on. And I think in a few years it'll be a little clearer because it turns out the orphan problem is really bad all the way down to all the bacteria. None of the major, there's no protein that's conserved.
Right, and I think that's a really good point. Really good points, and I think the orphan, even with orphan genes, for example, these taxonomically restricted and essential genes, they have really no explanation for it, and the only explanation that I've received is de novo gene synthesis. And I always point out, like, guys, this is a circular based argument because you're saying that de novo gene synthesis must be true because orphan genes exist, and orphan genes exist because of de novo gene synthesis. Like, guys, can't you not see the circularity? And I noticed you, Salvador, was pointing out the the functional roles found in the endogenous retroviruses and in all these other classes of retrotransposons, and they have to assume that those were co-opted, or they were inserted and these functional roles were adopted, and the evolutionists say there's paper after paper proving this. No, they're just asserting it and assuming it, just like the de novo gene synthesis. So, and I saw you pointed that out too, and I thought, bam, you got it.
I don't think Mike quite got it. I said you can't cite those papers because they're all based on circular reasoning.
It's true. I was waiting for you too, and you were being very patient. So I was like, is Sal going to point it out? And bam, you pointed it out right away. And they always downplay it too. And I say, guys, these ERVs are not just functional. They literally have crucial functions that help regulate genes. They determine cell types. And we can go on and on and on, of course, but just claiming that they were co-opted or adopted is just mere storytelling. It's just, and Sal, you've probably read the papers like me, like they just almost assert the co-option at the end of the paper, and then the evolutionists will read it and see, they've got an explanation for it when really they don't.
It's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. And, I genuinely like Mike. Okay,
nice guy.
There's, like I said, James I can't get along with. I like Mike. I can't stand James. Oh my goodness, I'd be turning red through that whole thing. And if I get angry, I don't argue well. So.
Well, you being
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, you being an extremely intelligent individual and well educated, mind you, an aggressive you would be scary, so I don't think these evolutionists like RJ want to see you aggressive like that, so
I'd tear him to pieces, really. I mean, he has the temperament. One time he said, where's the citation, because the anus of the fish and the what they call the urogenital opening, which is analogous to the vagina. I wish I had the diagram. It's reversed than the order in a human. So they say we evolved from a fish. And I just pointed that out. I said, James, you may be citing all these bones, but doesn't that bother you? Because this was on the chat, because he was saying my arguments are terrible. I said, it's on the chat. You know, it was on the chat, and I said, it's right there in anatomy diagrams. I said, you know, it have to flip. And I said, you know, the thing is like, you know, if Mr. Fish sees, you know, his green girl from a distance and he swims up and he sees that she's not quite wired right, no disrespect to anyone with birth defects, but, you know, he'll go, oh, you know, sorry, Miss Fish, it's not you, it's me. And then he swims away. Don't you see the problem here? And he demanded, "Where's the citation for that?" And,
Of course.
And then I looked. You know, I said it's in any anatomy diagram of a fish. Just look it up. And he said, "Where's the citation? I don't believe you." And then I gave him a citation, and he was silent. I said, "So what do you have to say now?" And he just was silent. And then one time I said, you know, he said, "Oh, evolutionary biologists are the only ones who study ERVs." And I was like, "Want to back that up? You better make a retraction." Because I was so irritated, and I just hammered him for the whole chat. I just said, "Hey, James, are you going to correct this?" He just was silent. So that's how I beat him up in a debate. I just never let him go.
So is this what you guys
Is this on video somewhere?
Is it? I think it was in a chat. You were saying, Sal?
It was in the chat, and I'm trying to remember.
Oh man, this was a verbal debate.
I want to point out something to James Downard, who always says citation. You know, we were discussing ALUs, and I have a paper that I actually got from Contested Bones, Intronic ALUs Influence Alternative Splicing. So I provided him that paper, and in my most recent debate, probably another 10 papers showing the regulatory activities of these transposable elements. And somebody like him will say, well, if you read them, you know, they'll give a reason how they got these functions, co-option, for example. And I've asked him, and not only him, pretty much everybody that I've ever had a discussion with on that specific topic, do you have any real technical paper that will show a non-functional, let's say an ERV or an ALU, going from non-functional to something extremely functional to you know, healthy life processes in the cell and our genetics, for example. And James Downard, he said, no, I have none that you would accept, which means he was almost admitting that, yeah, all these papers do is assert it with no real observable empirical data demonstrating it. So he's funny. He'll say citation, and you'll give it to him. And if it contradicts, you know, what he's saying, that's it. It'll end there.
And then they'll Google whoever it is and be like, "Oh, look, see, they've already been debunked." And it's like, oh my goodness, it never ends.
Oh, it's like with Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. I'll say, you know, he's using pedigree-based studies on mitochondrial DNA, and I'll point to the Parsons paper as well as 10 other pedigree-based studies that corroborate the 6,500-year date for mitochondrial Eve. And they'll say, oh, you know, those papers were debunked. He was debunked. I said, these are secular papers from Nature. And then you'll show it to them. Oh, well, mutation rates were slower in the past. It's like, okay, you know, then give me a testable prediction as to when it slows down or when it accelerates, because creation scientists are making predictions. And then, oh, there's too many variables and they can't do it. So it looks like we're the ones doing the science.
SFT, are you when you said the Nature, are you saying the 1998 one, or do you have a more recent one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Parsons paper, I think, was just the first one. That was in 1997. You got the Gibbons paper. That was, I think, the next year, where they reevaluated it. And the FBI adopted the mutation rate from the Parsons paper. So I was debating Erica, and I said, well, if it's so bad, why did the FBI adopt it? She said, well, because that's the observable mutation rate. Exactly. They always have to calibrate it with the fossil record in order to get their 200,000 year date of their Eve. They can't use the empirical method like we do.
I did not know that. Thanks.
Oh,
I saw you laughing, Salvador. That was pretty funny.
It's fascinating stuff. Well, you can find it in their own papers, right? Oh, you know, this is contradictory. The mitochondrial DNA only takes us back 6,500 years. Now we need to, you know, calibrate it with the fossil record. They admit it. They admit the circular reasoning right in their papers.
They said Ann Gibbons. They told me Ann Gibbons was invalid because that's not what she really said or something. Did you hear that too, or is I don't know?
Yes, yes. And Dr. Sanford always points out that they have to resort to a mutation rate that is unrealistic. And I believe, if I have his quote in front of me, I don't, unfortunately, but if I misquote, he said it's 20-fold slower than the observed mutation rate. 20-fold. So, and what's funny is there's no mitochondrial rate slow enough for the evolutionists to invoke to explain the data. Like Dr. Sanford points out, there's only a few mitochondrial DNA differences separating us from the Eve sequence. And same with the Y chromosome. I think the Y chromosome, there's only like 300 differences separating us from the Y chromosomal Adam sequence. And now we know the Y chromosome mutates fast. So that's easily accounted for in biblical times. So it's fascinating stuff.
And did I tell you guys what they think happened at the Y chromosome bottleneck? This is what they're currently teaching in class. Let me find the page. I just got it. So this is what they say. Huge plummet in the Y chromosome, right? And they say that there was 1 man to 17 women. And they said it took 2,000 years for that to get corrected. And I raised my hand and I asked my professor, and I was like, why didn't it just get corrected in the first generation in 20 years? I was like, were none of the women having boys? They're only having girls? Then how did they reproduce? Well, they try to factor it in like we were gorillas, right? So that there was this one male surrounded by 20 females, and the other men weren't able to pass on their Y chromosome because they couldn't reproduce. And then they try to say that it was like some kind of climate factor, but they really have no idea. Neolithic founder effects,
Right.
which means that they were going out and making new groups, and basically they have no idea.
No, they don't. They don't. Well, they have to invoke just to explain the low variability in mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and just genetic diversity in general. Like humans have low genetic diversity. So this wasn't a prediction from the evolutionists, but when they discovered it, that's when they resorted to the out of Africa hypothetical bottleneck that reduced the human population at the time. I believe they'll say 70,000 years ago to anywhere between 2 and 10,000 people, depending on who you talk to. But the thing is, this bottleneck would have involved severe inbreeding, and I've mentioned this many times, and the fixation of so many deleterious recessive mutations. And this bottleneck would have been extended. The evolutionists will say, but we're supposed to believe that this, highly genetically compromised population of 2 to 10,000 suddenly exploded into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the planet. It's just not feasible. And I always ask, how is this hypothetical scenario even remotely feasible? And they'll often point to the cheetahs today. Well, look at the cheetahs. They're doing fine, and they've experienced a bottleneck. Yeah, the cheetahs have declined to under 6,000. You can Google it. I just checked the other day. Their sperm is highly degenerate. There's so many deleterious recessive mutations coming to the forefront with them as well. Conservationists are worried that they're going to go extinct. So from what I've seen, there's no feasible way that this hypothetical bottleneck that they resort to explain the low genetic diversity has any real plausibility to it.
And what year are they giving you for that? Did you say 70,000 years ago?
Yeah, I believe 70,000 years ago is when they say the hypothetical bottleneck took place.
So what I was taught recently in my class, it was like 5,500 years ago.
Oh, they'll say there's a bottleneck 5,500 years ago as well?
No. This is the same one. It was called 100,000 Years of War. It was an anthropology class. And I was taught that there's a date spread because not everyone agrees, I guess. But the bottleneck happened 5,500 to 9,500 years ago. And I find that interesting because that actually matches the Neolithic Revolution, which is 5,500 to 10,000 years ago. And there's no diverse languages, according to anthropologists, more than 4,500 years ago.
Right.
Funny how it all keeps lining up with about 5,000 years. And
oh, it's funny. I know.
Yeah, but I don't know who's saying the 70,000, but current current anthropology research says 5,500.
Well, they're talking about because they're calibrating it to their expected dates, right? Modern man evolved from Homo erectus 200,000 years ago. They stayed on Africa. Well, I mean, they do believe in I think they believe in 2 out of Africa scenarios. But besides the point, yeah, it's 70,000 years ago, they'll say, is when their major bottleneck occurred. But the 5,500 year one, I mean, it could be like another bottleneck, or maybe that's just what the empirical data suggests, because they're only getting the 70,000 years because they're calibrating the genetic data with the fossil record data. But I always just say, okay, if that's true, how could this tiny, nearly extinct, genetically compromised population just suddenly explode into all parts of the planet, seizing dominion over the world? Like, it's just not. It's really not a feasible story at all.
Well, I'll go ahead and Google it. But I mean, this was 100,000 years of war, so they should have shown the 70,000 year one, and they didn't. They only showed the 5,500.
I wanted to say, I have a couple data points. Someone was asking about my exchange with James Downard. It was in the first few minutes of the Genesis flood debate between Nephilim-free and geology student James Downard. I was talking about Alus, and I said evolutionary biologists are probably the last set of people to tell us what Alus do. And James Downard said, "Oh, roll on the floor laughing, Salvador Cordova. Evolutionary biologists are literally the only ones who will do that, as they are the only ones doing the work now." I'm just like, you got to be. The people that do work on this are like, molecular biologists, structural biologists, cancer researchers. The last people you'd ask are evolutionary biologists. That got my blood boiling, because he was just taunting me. And so that whole debate, I said, James Downard, so what's your citation that evolutionary biologists are the only ones that do work on Alus? I mean, I just wouldn't. That's what I do when I get mad. Right. And he wouldn't back down. I said, you better make a retraction, bud, So
in other words, you cornered him pretty good.
Hey guys, listen, I actually have to go, but I wanted to say hi, Salvador. It's nice to meet you.
Oh, pleasure meeting you.
And Anon, it was nice meeting you. I think he might be. And nice talking to you, Jason. Praise and standing. And
likewise, thanks for coming.
Nice talking to you too.
It was a pleasure. You're always welcome. You're always welcome on.
I've seen your
bless.
super chats. That was pretty good.
Good work. And everybody subscribe to Shadow Dancer. She's doing great work, putting out great videos.
Aw, thank you. Well, God bless, guys, and have a good night.
God bless.
And gee, I hope I didn't drive her away.
No. She's been here for a while, Sal. It's probably getting pretty late for her, so no worries.
The other data point is, I mean, as you know, in Dr. Sanford's lecture, he mentioned, that one at the NIH, that infamous one.
Yes, I love that.
There was a paper. I found a paper and he cited it, and I'm like, well, I hope I don't get him in trouble for it. He said there was one paper that came out. He said all the RNA viruses had to have emerged in the last 50,000 years.
Right, I seen that, but yeah.
And so this debate's going back and forth, and I said I don't expect that evolutionary biologists are going to let that one go. They're going to try to find a way to bury it, and predictably they're coming out and going against it. But then I said, and I confronted an evolutionary biologist. I said, I don't understand coalescence models real well, but we need to talk about this a little bit, because I'm seeing this pattern across plants and across just about every species. I said, how do you calculate the most recent common ancestor? And, he gave an answer. I said, for that species, not the universal common ancestor. Right. And everywhere I looked, the bacteria, the plants, I said, Dr. Harshman, this doesn't look right. They all look like they came out recently, and everyone, every time they do gene sequencing, they all look like they emerged recently. And, the only time they'll say, well, this bacteria split from that, but I'll say, well, let's look carefully at the gene data. So even assuming that they split hundreds of millions of years ago, when is the most recent common ancestor that's available to us? And they were all lining up young. And so when I saw that paper on the RNA viruses, I said, that's exactly what I see everywhere else. So I think it's exciting what we're seeing with the humans. But when I saw your stuff on the DNA barcoding, and then I also was aware of that paper, I said, this is not surprising me, because I've been seeing it since like 2014. I think everything's about to explode. I mean, if they're just willing to look at the data, I think they're going to be bothered. Because I said, Dr. Harshman, how do you explain that all these bacteria have a common ancestor like in the last million years? and boy, he got really angry and defensive. And I said, there's a little problem in stirring the bacteria. You can't stir all the bacteria so that they can do what their thing. They don't have to pass. The funny thing is, you're going to have all the bacteria pass through a bottleneck simultaneously.
Wow, that's a great point. Yeah, so even the bacteria, the viruses, they have to humans. So it seems like everything on this planet, they've had to resort to some type of bottleneck one way or another. Because like you said, with the DNA barcoding, they go right into the mitochondria. They go to that CL1 gene, which is highly conserved. And the research on that demonstrates that over 90% of all life has the exact same level of genetic diversity, meaning clearly that almost all life on Earth is the same age. Now we can corroborate that with the RNA viruses, the bacteria, humans, but then all they can say is, okay, well, everything must have gone through this massive genetic bottleneck. Even though we do believe in a massive genetic bottleneck at the flood 4,500 years ago, so it fits well with us. I wanted to ask you, Sal, obviously you are familiar with Dr. Sanford's paper. He went over it as well at the NIH lecture, the waiting time problem.
Yes.
I'm fascinated with that. I have read it. It's actually been a little while, a highly technical one. Yeah. Has there been, I know he was saying that over 10,000 scientists, I believe, have looked it over. It's a rock solid paper. Has there been any response to that paper, or even an attempted rebuttal?
Not that I know of. And actually, one of our colleagues, and maybe I shouldn't mention their names right now because I think their papers actually may be in the process of review. There's another project with some really top guys from Europe. So I'll just leave it at that are supporting Dr. Sanford's work.
Didn't Ann Gallagher, though, and also Stephen Meyer put this, or Dembski, they put that out on waiting time with that one too, I thought.
Well, it's not just it was Ola Hajger and Gager, maybe, I don't know, but Durrett and Schmidt, and then some others had their waiting time problem, even Michael Lynch. So it's not like, they keep trying to say that this is a John Sanford thing. Anything he says, they'll just pretend he's the first one to say it. And he's really, God bless him, he's very innovative, but a lot of what he says is other people will say too. They just don't want to admit it, because then that means it's their side. Before I go on, I do want to say something briefly. What I said about all the coalescence, that was in a passing. I haven't done serious research on it. So if readers see something that doesn't agree with what I said, just keep an open mind that I could be wrong. But I just have a feeling as more data comes in, like the DNA barcode, we're going to keep seeing anomalies. I'm just like, I don't have to prove my point today. God has all this. He's hidden this away for us to discover in this day and age. I just feel that.
Amen.
So, as far as what was your question again, Praise?
I had another question for you with Nathaniel Jeanson. I think he had also a mitochondrial date to 6,000 or some years. Do you think that's a valid paper to you? Do you support that?
Well, Praise, he was. Nathaniel Jensen's using the pedigree-based secular papers that we talk about. Parsons paper, Gibbons papers. There's over, I think, there's a bunch of sets of the pedigree-based studies, but they all corroborate on roughly the same 6,500 year date, which the evolutionists, that even critique Nathaniel Jensen, they'll agree on, but they'll their objection to it is Jensen is assuming I like to say consistent rates, because we know that rates slightly change. I mean, you can get small inbreeding populations where obviously the rates are going to speed up a little bit, but for the most part, he's assuming consistent rates. And when you assume consistent rates, the mitochondrial DNA goes back 6,500 years ago, and amazingly enough, the Y chromosome only goes back to 4,500 years ago. And he laid that out in a most recent technical paper, which would obviously be Y chromosome Noah. But the evolutionist response to that is Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, being a young Earth creationist, is not calibrating these dates with their fossil record. And I always point out that's a circular argument, since the fossil record is exactly what we're questioning. So why would we calibrate it with that which we are questioning? You know, the geological column is what's in question. We're not going to assume that's true to come up with our dates, since the dates, based on the empirical method, go back to just 6,500 years for the mitochondrial DNA and 4,500 years for the Y chromosome. But I don't know. I say, don't you see your circularity? And they say no. But I think deep down inside, they can see it.
Well, if I could say this, you'll find me to be maybe quite a bit more cautious than other creationists and embracing something. Even I'm very cautious, skeptical of what I say, because they're just like, well, you know, I have to qualify. But can I tell you a quick story about Nathaniel and I?
Of course, yeah. Take your time.
We were at Lipscomb University at a Christian Scholars Conference, and I was presenting on chromatin, and Nathaniel was presenting on his book on speciation, and we were in front of Christian biology faculty. I couldn't believe how hostile they were. I couldn't believe how rude. And the chemistry professor, did you all watch Is Genesis History? And Joe DeWeese is on the extra the Is Genesis History lectures. Well, he was the one that organized it, and he said, "Yeah, this is kind of a rough crowd." I have to tell you, it was really scary what we see go on in colleges that name the name of Christ, and how hostile they are to creationists.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, so that's how Nathaniel and I met. we were all kind of persecuted together, and we we're in front of Dr. McClure. Yeah, I'm calling him out. He's practically screaming at us.
Are these theistic evolutionists? Is that why?
Oh yeah,
wow.
Old earthers.
Well, you know, the thing is,
that's a shame.
The people that like at least ID are the engineers. But it's the theologians there. Oh my goodness! And I'm sorry to be calling this out, but just a little anecdote. So this is the battle we're fighting. It's also among our own, and you know, I'm not that combative, but I couldn't believe how hostile they were. I wasn't even talking about Young Earth Creation. I was just talking about the ENCODE project.
That's incredible. I just can't believe that mystifies me.
Well, that's pretty cool. I would have loved to hear that talk. I mean, you got two highly intellectual individuals like yourself and Dr. Jensen, but I can imagine you guys handled yourselves well, though, even if it was a hostile crowd.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I just had that had nothing to do with your all's questions, but I do think I just kind of like to see the data, because the funnest thing is when the secular world starts admitting that there's a problem, just like with the DNA barcodes. That's when you have a really easy case. You don't have to quote creationists anymore.
Right, it's true.
Because when I did the abiogenesis thing, I didn't have to quote creationists. I just quoted original life researchers. And even when I was talking about junk DNA, I just had to show that it wasn't creationists against evolutionists. It was medical researchers.
Right.
It was so funny. So, like I said, I appreciate your all's interest, but I've gotten to the point I'm just going to wait on the Lord, because he's just making this really easy. And I'll tell you one thing that's happening at the NIH. I'm sensing a change in temperament among the medical researchers quietly, because they see it. I was in a biochemistry class there at the NIH, and the professor is saying, "Oh wow, this you see this metabolic system? It's just incredibly designed." And he said, "Oh wait, I'm not supposed to say that." And the whole class laughed.
That word's not allowed.
Is that true, Salvador? Like ID proponents, like they have to go through the gauntlet to get a paper through. I heard Dembski had to wait 7 years just to get one paper through. Is that true, according to what you observed?
Yes, absolutely. Now, because Dr. Sanford has a great reputation, Cornell professor, it's really hard to just say no, but we've gotten rejected. And I'll tell you that the paper we have, it's been rejected maybe 4 or 5 times already. And we just halfway gave up. And I'll tell you what's really funny. Standing for Truth knows about Joshua Swamidas.
Yes.
We were on his website and I said, Josh, because people were just chiding me, why don't creationists get stuff peer reviewed? I said, well, I can tell you, we have a paper that people at the NIH reviewed and privately said, you're right, Salvador. And I'll tell you specifically what it was. It was about nylon-eating bacteria. Right. We determined that this was basically a hoax because Dennis Venema in his book, God in the Genome or something, this was published 2016. His favorite example of evolution was the nylon-eating bacteria gene, the nylonase gene. And he said this came about by a frame shift and like 400 of the 400 of the 430 amino acids got flipped because of the frame shift. And he was saying, see, random mutations, a totally random protein or polypeptide can make a new function. And John was really irritated. He called me up one day. He said, Sal, can you just look on this? That doesn't sound right. Can you just do a homology search?
I thought it was Dennis Lamore, or you know what I'm talking about, SOT. He's a theistic evolutionist. He went against Stephen Meyer and Lawrence Krauss in a debate.
You're talking about Dennis Lamoureux, but there's also a Dennis Venema too. Dennis Venema is.
Oh, I didn't even know Venema. Wow, I just learned. Wow, interesting.
Yeah, Dennis Venema is a very prominent scientist at. Well, I'm going to say BioLogos. I'm not entirely certain if he still works there, but.
Well, we cut him down a few notches.
Good.
Well, I'll tell you the whole story. The first thing is, well, I did a homology search, and I said, John, I got 25 homologs. He said, yeah, I think this is wrong. These may have pre-existed nylon. And I'll never forget, I was driving back from his house. I said, Lord, I don't know how to tell him. I said, that feels still kind of thin. Anyway, I got a breakthrough. I found 4,000 or 5,000 homologs. I'm like, oh my goodness, there are bacteria all over the place with this. It couldn't have been just because of nylon. And then I found out humans and pigs have this trypsin gene, and trypsin can break down nylon. So It's in mammals, it's in bacteria, it's even in plants. I said, this means it pre-existed. I said, it can't be. I mean, the guy who came up with this hypothesis was Ono. I said, they can't be that wrong, can they? So we circulated this out. All the editors came back. They said either it's out of the scope or this is very interesting. At least 2 editors said, you're right, but we're not going to publish your paper. But on Joshua Swamidas's website, an editor from the Cell, which is a pretty high up journal, he said, your paper has some issues, but Ono was wrong. Ono was the guy who came up with the hypothesis. So there we have in public an editor from a major journal saying that our conclusion was actually correct, but we're not going to get it published. I mean, I'll give you the link. It's hilarious.
That's amazing.
So you're asking, do we get resisted? I'm like, yeah, but at least some people have at least a smidgen of integrity to actually acknowledge that. We're not going to publish you, but you're correct. And I'm like, well, thank you. It actually helped.
How biased is that? We're not going to publish you.
So what happened to Venema?
It's funny, but it's not funny.
He withdrew his claim. I'm just like, oh my goodness.
Well, that's his number one example in Adam in the Genome is that one.
Is it called nylonase or something?
Yeah, nylon digestion by bacteria. And I think I know the paper you're referring to. It's been a while since I looked at it and read it.
It's
Salvador,
been revised several times. I'm going to put it in the private chat because I don't know how to put it in the
Oh,
public
nice.
chat.
I always thought I found it on the geneticentropy.org. I always look at the latest development section.
That might have been the older paper. I'll give you a link to the newer one. But,
okay, that'd be awesome.
So are they resisting us? Oh, absolutely. And there's things that we could say that they won't let us say. Whenever, we submitted to an evolutionary biology journal, and, they're saying, well, this, they'll give us some excuse why. And just like, I wanted to write back and say, well, why won't you let us publish? You publish so much other garbage.
You're absolutely right.
How is it I'm going to submit to a journal and say this is all bunk? I mean, you can imagine James Tour, even with all his standing, it'd be hard for him, I think, to publish to some chemistry journals or origin of life research journals and say this is all junk. It's just not going to, do you see what I'm saying? Because it's like violating their creeds.
That's amazing. So would you say then, I guess for more the layman with the nylon digestion, because you're saying that the information, so it's pre-programmed adaptation is what it is. It's not really anything novel.
It wasn't even that good.
Really? Oh, wow.
It may have been that the gene didn't even have to mutate. That's how bad it was. Because I found evidence of some of these bacteria out in the Indian Ocean that could degrade nylon, and they weren't exactly in a concentrated environment out there in the ocean.
That's amazing.
Or maybe one or two point mutations, maybe, or residue mutations. But the fact is, why is it that humans can degrade nylon?
Right.
In fact, we can digest a little bit of it. There's a medication called Amicar, which is a nylon monomer, and our bodies can digest that. But then they tested this pig trypsin in the 1950s on nylon, and I said, that pig didn't evolve this in response to the presence of nylon. It had the pre-existing ability to degrade it.
Right.
And I ran this by chemists, and they said, even the reviewer said, you're right. The fold in the nylon, the way the nylon, it has something that looks like an amide bond, and so these amidases that exist in biology, they can break that bond down. And there's some not so very honest things in the evolutionary literature. Oh, I should mention Ken Miller, who was in the Dover trial.
Right.
He was promoting the nylonase thing, and it was just it was so dishonest the way he did it, because he would conflate experiments that had nothing to do with each other as if it were one experiment. He made it look like Ono did actually laboratory experiments, and all he did was just imagination. I mean, that's just not right. That is just.
Then he did co-option too, and I mean, I swear that Meyer and there's someone else that they debunked this co-option thing because they showed us in a degraded state, and it was like the shaft in a degraded state. So
Sal, what a lot of these changes then, obviously you're saying, pre-programmed adaptive mechanisms, and it wouldn't even really need the mutation. So a lot of it would be, I know you're saying you're not a huge fan of, the term epigenetics because there's so much to it. But a lot of this would be the environment. Certain genes are turned on and off. That ability, for example, the nylon, to degrade the nylon, it's already in the system, pre-existing, kind of just waiting to be used or turned on based on that environmental trigger. Like, would that be a good way to explain it, or if you want to expound on it?
I'll tell you what, I have a different view than what has been promoted by other creationists, and I've taught. There's a young Earth creationist by the name of Joe DeWeese. He's a professor. He's an associate professor of biochemistry at Lipscomb, and also an adjunct professor at Vanderbilt. So he's very, very smart. He's also a young Earth creationist, and he continues to be published in secular literature, which boggles my mind.
Wow, that's interesting.
In fact, he and I published an abstract last year in 2019 on on experimental biology on the topoisomerase enzyme. But he and I said, Joe, you know, I think genes can actually gain information a little bit, not too much. I think they can actually gain. And he said, yeah, I think, you know, he said he's changed his mind. He said, I think they're a little bit more flexible than we give them credit for. Because I know that's hard to hear, because it's nice to say there's just one law that information will never increase. But I would not go there. I think the genomes may be a little bit more intelligent, as in artificially intelligent, than we are giving it credit for. God designed them to have a little more adaptation. And one thing I'll point out is, especially for anything with catalytic ability, you can take random polypeptides. I mean, just, you know, take amino acids and put them in some arbitrary sequence. They'll have catalytic activity towards some set of substances. And some people will call it enzymatic. But what I say is, this is much like going to a junkyard and running a tornado through it. You'll make lots of paperweights. I mean, it's just really easy to do. And so what is not very honest by evolutionary biologists is to point these. It said, look at these new functions, and just like, yeah, you made paperweights. That's easy to do. But then I'll show them a protein complex that has a lot of quaternary structure, and yeah, they'll give up at that point. So when you're asking me, is there some adaptation? Even Michael Behe has kind of said, you know, there's some potential for minor adjustments, and even some, maybe even major adjustments. Rarely.
Now, would that just be, you know, general fine tuning of, I guess I know you're not a huge fan, I guess, of information, the word information, but let's just say fine tuning of the pre-existing information, or is it, or some of these changes you're saying maybe they add to the information? Like there's novelty there.
Can I tell you why I think so?
Of course, yeah. Go ahead. Just
like we learn, you and I learn, we're able to change, you know, the state of our neural circuits and all. I think the germlines can learn a little bit, not much. Right. It's limited. And that's also why, just as an FYI, that's why I like arguing abiogenesis, because you don't have any front loading. It's very easy to make the case there. So I would say there's a little bit of learning, but not much. But this will be borne out in the human genome, how much our genomes are improving, because I don't think they're improving. I don't know any major geneticists. So even if there is a little bit of adaptation, it'll happen in bacteria, not so much in humans. And I'll tell you, this is a question I'll always pose to an evolutionist. I'll say, can you tell me one trait that you think is relatively recent in the human genome somewhere, for, say, a minority population? Can you tell me if that's if that trait is going to fixate in the entire population?
Right.
One beneficial trait. So give me one beneficial trait that you think is going to be, part of the human genome. Just give me a time frame and name the trait.
That's a great question.
Beneficial trait. So I say, here it is. We're just talking about everyday life right now. We're not even talking about the distant past. If you can't name a single beneficial trait that's going to fix in the human genome in the next, you name the time frame. If you can't name that now, why should we trust you to say that for the past? I said, don't you see this as illogical? If you can't demonstrate it now, why do you expect it's going to work in the past? So, sorry. I think
it kind of reminds me of Haldane's dilemma, because if you look at all the DNA differences between chimps and humans, even according to their time frame, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sal, those DNA differences would have to be fixated. So I think you'd have to have tens or even hundreds of millions of beneficial mutations that arose in that time frame. Because obviously they were evolving and adapting separately since the split, and then those would have to go to fixation all during that time frame, which means that scenario would require like probably over 1,000 independent beneficial fixations, even per generation. So how, because they're fixated, like you said, these DNA differences are fixated in the entire population. So how is that even possible? Go ahead, Sal.
It can only happen through neutral mutation, and there is that's kind of complicated, where the you can get quite a bit of fixation if it's neutral, but that leads to other complications, like especially, how can neutral mutations, if they're just random walks, how are they going to create new integrated functions?
Right, good point.
And so that relates to the waiting time problem. We never got around to it, but I was saying, John, look at these zinc fingers. Look, because I was showing them in my last talk, and you could actually see that it takes like say 50 amino acid differences to make a new function. And John looked at that and he said, Sal, I was only talking about 3 nucleotide mutations, and it would take 76 million years. You found something that's like 150. He said it's just blowing it out of the water. So, he said, he for a couple of days, he said, we need to write a paper on that. And then he moved on. He said, we'll wait on it. There are other things to work on.
There's just so many things I could. So you just made the problem 100-fold greater for the evolutionists now,
right?
Just from that simple observation.
I'd like to maybe give a talk sometime on protein structure and function, because it's a little easier to see. The zinc finger was the one that it's easy to show, but then I could show if you select other proteins.
Absolutely,
it's not so. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was saying absolutely. It's always a pleasure having you on. So we'd love to have
awesome.
as many lectures as possible. We're always intrigued by your knowledge.
Because when you actually see when you see the differences in folds, you'll see how hard it is to mutate one protein to another. It really is a lot harder than. In bacteria, I think they have some built-in adaptation to help them make kind of new proteins that may have some enzymatic activity. What we don't see is when they really build new what they call multi-protein complexes, like I showed one such complex in fruit flies and in humans called the polycomb repression complex, that has 5 or 6 proteins, and it's just nuts how well it's so many parts have to connect. This is like a car engine, where every screw has to line up into the threads of the whole. I mean, it's just really good.
Mind-boggling.
And that's the thing, so what's not very honest is evolutionists will point to some new catalytic ability. I'm just like, guys, you have no clue. I mean, Mike got on my case for me saying that, so sorry about that, Mike. I got a little carried away, but that's how I do feel, Well, out of the heart comes what you really, out of the mouth comes how you really feel. And I'm like, yeah, no clue. Sorry, that's just how I feel.
No, that's okay.
Like if you look at the structure, this is like expecting 2 random pieces of metal to become a screw and a hole, a screw and a nut.
It's not going to happen. Exactly.
So it's not this catalytic ability; it's the ability of proteins to fit together. Because all of these are machines, these protein complexes,
right?
And you're just trivializing how this has to hook together. So,
well, and you just talking about proteins too. It reminds me of alternative splicing, which I'll often bring up in discussions and debates. That the fact that a single protein coding region of our DNA can actually give rise to hundreds or even thousands of different functional proteins. Like how even if you want to be the devil's advocate, I don't know, how does somebody from a naturalistic or evolutionist perspective explain such a thing?
They don't from the laws of physics and chemistry that we know. And I'll tell you something that is very interesting. I really like Mike, Speed of Sound, and he said something that's very interesting. and it echoes something John of Vice had said. John of Vice wrote the book Non-Intelligent Design, and he was just ragging on repetitive elements. And the reason I'm looking at it is I really want to write an article to crush him because he just humiliated himself in that book.
I'd be the first to read that.
Yeah, he was
Good
just
one.
bragging on how stupid the designer would be to make all these repetitive elements. And I'm reading all these papers that said the repetitive elements are so critical to the 3,4D nucleome. I'm just like, yeah. So he just embarrassed himself. But anyway, Avise said, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the book handy. He said, again, a paraphrase, atheists believe in God. They just spell his name nature, not Yahweh. And so you asked how they explain it. They worship nature, just like it said in Romans.
Right, just like it says in Romans, amen.
Right. They worship the creature rather than the creator. And so they look at nature, and it explains a lot of their behavior. I mean, this is really disturbing because some among the intelligentsia, they're advocating the extermination and extinction of the human race. And I said, yeah, that's because they look at the human race destroying their God. And so when, someone earlier was talking about the sacrifices to Molech,
right?
And these pagan gods, see, they're looking at having the human race extinct. And I get that sentiment, with it's kind of disturbing because in some of the circles, that's what they really want to do. That's where their heart is. So how do they explain this? It's like, oh, to them, nature did it, even though it's not logical. That's their God.
Well, and let me ask you, Sal, because you made a really good point today with Mike, and I can't remember exactly how you said it, so I'm kind of putting it into my own words. But regarding these repetitive sequences of so-called viral DNA, if viral DNA is inserted at random into our genome or anything's genome, isn't it more likely to disrupt the existing genes as compared to result into something extremely functional in, I mean, you name it, right? Regulating genes, the placenta, the embryo. I remember you said something like that to Mike, where it's not going to lead to some important function. It's going to disrupt the genes, would it not?
For Alus, definitely. And I'm sorry I can't speak to some of the others because I'm only beginning to learn some of the ERVs. But
of course, yeah, no problem.
There was the one by Ayala, and he was saying, what designer would make all these repetitive Alus? And then he went on to say that there are about, I think it was 20, and Mike and I were trying to look up that quote, but they took it down because he was accused of some improprieties with women or whatever. That was news to me. But Ayala had said I think it was 20, and so many of those are implicated in human defects. And so that's the evidence. I said, exactly what you said. I said, look at the medical evidence. This is not a good thing when it's just, you're just throwing this stuff all over the place. We can't tolerate those mutations. So if someone would Google the effects of ALU insertions and birth defects, you'll get some hits. So it's known, but it totally makes sense because as you saw with how the ALUs are used to make those loops that help gene regulation across cell types.
Right.
If that gets messed up,
exactly.
You could mess up the cell type. So exactly what we see. And the thing is, God has brought us an ally in the biotech and medical industry because these people are studying disease. So they're seeing, we're going to continue to have evidence of what happens when we have random insertions. And I just like, Mike, that's just too hard to believe that
I agree.
You could just be throwing this all over the genome and it's going to be okay.
It's not going to be. So what you're saying, so if these really are, let's say, functional DNA elements that, I mean, I believe were created by God, obviously at creation, if they are mutated, something that's, because a lot of these transposable elements are important in self-stress responses, our immune system. I mean, I've read papers where they're important in a variety of protective measures. If they're mutated, that's disrupting that important DNA element that can lead to disease.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they're looking to the disease associated with these elements and trying to say, see, this is evolution, or this is evidence that these are insertions, from millions of years ago. Is that kind of their point there?
Can you repeat the illogic again? I'm sorry.
No problem. Because well, I guess my point would be that the ALUs, the ERVs, just the retrotransposons exactly, in general, if they really are functional DNA elements that, I mean, my position would say God created these, but they've been mutated over time. Some of them, that mutation disrupting that functional DNA element will lead to disease. Like it makes sense from my personal worldview, I guess would be my point.
Yes, it will lead to disease. Now, something interesting is these I saw this in the CTCF protein. The reason that the ERVs are slightly different, and they'll attribute it to mutation over time, and it's not. It looks like this is a hierarchical control system.
Right.
And this is a whole nother. That's a whole nother interesting topic, and. You may wonder why I don't pursue it. I said, it's just a matter of time before our own medical industry starts writing creationist papers for us.
I feel like some of them they already are with. I mean, like, so even me for like my debates, one of them was with Erica. I can only fit so many secular technical papers into my slideshow. That's roughly 8 minutes or so, and I have to pick and choose between so many regarding like functional roles in all of these DNA elements, whether it be the retrotransposons or the pseudogenes, for example, that turn out to be highly functional, right?
Yeah.
Which is exactly what I would say intelligent design advocates or creationists have been predicting all along. So it's, just like you said, pretty soon they're going to be writing, I would say, more and more technical papers supporting our side, because already I find so many that are just supportive of I'd say creation.
Well, the thing that I found in the more advanced papers, they use the word evolution less and less. And it almost seems the only reason they put it in is so it would pass peer review.
Good point. I agree with you on that one.
It's like, okay, they had that one token mention of evolution. It's like, okay, it'll pass.
You're in.
and
just about every single citation can be interpreted.
I'm sorry?
So just about every single citation can be interpreted in the creationist worldview, creation worldview. Like every single citation that they give us, that's why they don't give us citations anymore, because every time they give us one, we say thanks, that helps us with this, that, or whatever, you know what I mean?
Well, Sal, maybe
and so they just don't give us, they don't want to help us anymore, so they don't give us citations to prove their point.
Sal, you should slip in the word evolution somewhere, anywhere in your next technical paper that you want to pass peer review, and boom, you'll be good to go.
Yeah, you know what? I've given up. I think I can't speak for John, but I personally given up. I told him, John, I'm going to start trying to publish in Popular, because this is just getting silly. Like I said, I really wanted to write the editors back. I said, 99% of what you publish is garbage. So why don't you publish our garbage? So
unbelievable.
First off, I did put something in the private chat, and you can post it on the public chat.
Sure.
And you can see that they tried to savage our nylonase paper, and I said, guys, it doesn't matter. So I had to debate them. I had to say, okay, so our paper is wrong, but and you may not like our materials and methods, but is our conclusion right? Because that's all that really matters,
Right. And they admitted it was right, you're saying?
Yeah. In fact, it's in one of the comments. Look for the comment by Steve Matheson. Steve Matheson is, he's an ex-Christian, and now he's the editor of Cell. He was a theistic evolutionist who debated Stephen Meyer, and he was advertising, "Oh, you can be a Christian and an evolutionist."
What's his name?
Longer, he abandoned his faith, but anyway, he became the editor of Cell. And even though I said some not so nice about him, Matheson said Ono was wrong. So when you hear him say Ono was wrong, that means that was what we really needed him to say. So
this is Dr. Swamidas. He's one of the major ones that has a problem with the paper. Does he have a problem with the conclusion as well?
No, he doesn't. So, I mean, these guys were just trying to trash me, and they say, "Oh, you know, this is a hit piece or that," and just like, you know, So I said, "Okay, well, you know, let's." So I just thanked them. I said, "Thanks for the editorial feedback," which actually was good, because then I cleaned up the paper even more. And it's like, okay, do you have any other excuses now? Because it's not there.
So Dr. Swamidas says, because you said, but was Ono wrong? He says Ono didn't have the same information as us. That paper was from decades ago. He does not deserve any disrespect, even if the data from decades later shows him wrong. So he's admitting that he was wrong.
Scroll down and look for SF Matheson. And he'll say, my understanding is Ono was wrong. And the important thing is, I'll tell you the important thing, on another thread about Biologos, because Dr. Swamidas left Biologos, he found that shortly after Dr. Sanford and I started publishing on this, Venema withdrew his article on nylon-eating bacteria from the
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he withdrew it. And then...
So by him withdrawing it, is he admitting that he was wrong? His conclusions were wrong, ultimately.
Yes, we thought that was kind of shady, and then he did in a very small sentence somewhere, and maybe it's worth digging up. He admits that it was wrong, and so this is really kind of bad, because then this is egg on Ken Miller's face, who was at the Dover trial, the infamous intelligent design trial. So that's Ken Miller, that's Dennis Venema, and anyone else, and who's been citing it. And I was laughing with John. I said, John, this is one of the most cited papers that never got published.
So have you ever had any discourse with Dr. Swamidas, or just pretty much in text format here?
Yeah, we've had good interactions. It's kind of tough, because a lot of times I want to say, Doc, you're doing the devil's work, and I don't like it. You know, I don't say that to his face.
Right.
Because it's like, all right, dear Lord, you know, I've done some things that were wrong in my life, and maybe some of my ideas were bad, and I was teaching wrong things, and you know, it's not my place to pass judgment. I can say I disagree, and I think the science is bad, and that's about all. You know, I'm not gonna. And it's been a little tough, and I've actually tried to understand. And
well, you're doing phenomenal work, Salvador. I mean, I see here the comment from SF Matheson, where he says Ono was wrong. He says it right here.
Yeah, there are a few little more exchanges on that, and so that the reason this was valuable, we were all laughing. I said, so the editors are publicly admitting that we're right, but you know, we're not good enough to publish. That's what I was saying. You know, I really want to write these evolutionary biology journals. I said, you know what? Why don't you let us publish?
Silver, if you mind, if I don't mind asking you, did you think the Dover trial was sabotage? I feel it was with the ACLU. What the hell does the ACLU have to do with the judge? And shouldn't scientific matters be decided into like some type of you know, scientific environment? And I mean, it makes no sense to me, this whole thing going on there.
Yeah, it was bad, and I know I'm going to offend a lot of ID proponents, creationists, and no offense intended. I personally don't think ID is. I think ID is true, but I don't classify it as science. So there are a lot of truths that I don't classify as science. I do think it's true, and it's right at the edge of science because I think
Belief.
science points to intelligent design.
Yeah, the data fits creation better than it fits evolution.
Right.
And that's all we ever say. We don't say that one proves the other outright, but it's just that the data seems to fit.
Right. They don't even use the word. Fit. Yeah, they don't. They don't even think they use the word "prove" in science. But the data and evidence, as Jason said, fits.
Yeah, I've been tempted to just use Eugene Koonen's words, and more of as kind of a euphemism that everyone should recognize. Because he was arguing that the origin of life came through the multiverse, and I just want to use that. He said, anytime we run across an evolutionary transition, we can't explain. I'll see, the multiverse explained this very well,
Right.
So I think everyone will know that that's the code word. And I almost sometimes think he's a closet creationist because it sounds so outrageous. Because for every problem we have, because Haeckel himself said evolution's the new magic word by which we'll solve all the riddles. That's a great quote. And that's exactly
what's happening. A great quote.
But I wanted to point something out about peer review. This is really sad. I was in the April 28th. This is kind of this is a praise actually. I was shortly after I had my near loss of faith and I started to get rebuilt in faith. I was studying the ID movement. And so I started an ID group at George Mason University in 2004. And a fellow student she and I were just at the cafeteria, just two of us. And I don't know why God put it on my heart. I said, let's pray that our little work here will get national attention and it won't be forgotten. And I don't know why God put that on my heart. 3 months later, a reporter from Nature came trying to get a hold of me. I'm like, why do they want to get a hold of me? I'm nobody. And well, he came to my first ID meeting in 2000. He contacted me 2004, 2005. He came to my meeting, and you can actually look this up. I'll post a link to it. He came to my meeting, and there was a professor there by name Dr. Carolyn Crocker, who is a professor of biology. And so it turned out he wanted to interview both me and her. Well, our story is published in the journal Nature, and we got in the cover story. So that's the first time a Young Earth Creationist was in the journal, a scientific journal. And we got national attention just like I prayed. Sadly, Dr. Crocker 3 weeks later was fired, and then she got in the movie Expelled. But this relates to the whole thing about peer review. She was told, and she has a testimony on this, she started, after she got fired from George Mason University, she's working in a laboratory. And so she did some research, but then her boss was told, they said, if they put Carolyn Crocker's name on this paper that reports the lab results, you'll never get another grant. You'll never get another grant. So they kicked her out. So not only will they not publish your papers, if it's connected to a grant, some people will pull some strings and make sure you're blacklisted. I mean, they play hardball. So they'll do this with your papers. They'll do this with people's jobs. I found out there's a guy named Norbert Smith. He was even on the BBC doing. He's a PhD biologist and professor, and he was wrestling crocodiles, and that's why he got on British television because it was just so cool. They fired him because he was a creationist. He spent the rest of his life as a truck driver. So, yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Spend the rest of your life as a truck driver. Yeah. Anyway, what a wasted talent.
I know. But I think in some respects, things, some things are getting really bad, and then some things are getting really sad. So it's the good thing is the data. I'm going to put something in the private chat. and you can put it on the public chat. That's an article that might be of interest because I wanted to show the interest in intelligent design and creation. And so they actually published my poll. 75% of the college students want to study intelligent design and creation science. And the universities are just going to teach them crap instead. But I was hoping the universities would see this and see it as a money opportunity if they wouldn't teach intelligent design because they believed in it. They might do it for money. And I still think they could get a lot more money if they would teach it. So I just included that. So that had nothing to do with anything else. Sorry.
So you guys ready to call it? It's been a while. It's been like 3 hours.
Hey guys, yeah, I stepped away for a second. Actually, to be honest with you, we could probably do this all night. I have, unfortunately, with the kids, I got to be up in, well, really probably about 4 hours. But I do want to say, I want to give a shout out to Salvador. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks so much for your phenomenal work. Hopefully, we can set up at a time most convenient for yourself a lecture on, it was protein structure, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we would love that. We love kind of sitting back and learning from you.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's nice to have an expert on your side. Wow.
Anytime you're available, it'd be an honor. But once again, thanks for coming on tonight. It was a blast. Time flew by. We'll shut it down, but I want to, if you have any final words, Sal, you're free.
I don't. I mean, thanks guys for letting me share, and I think we live in a very special time. I will tell you that I nearly lost my faith, and that 40 years ago when I first became a creationist, there's so few arguments and data compared to what we have now, and it's just flooding in. So this is stuff that was hidden in our genomes and in our cells since humanity was born. And so now it's in the 21st century. We're seeing the works of God like no other generation in history. And I think that was by design.
Amen.
Oh, yeah,
Amen.
I agree.
And I was saying earlier, Sal, that, the Bible says without faith, it's impossible to please God. And God didn't have to give us all of this evidence. And as you say, all of this evidence that's just been hidden in our genome since creation. He didn't have to give us that. But yet we're living in a time where we have so much undeniable lines of evidence, especially in genetics, as we can pretty much talk about all day. So as the Bible says, we really are without excuse. So amen to that. I agree with what you said, Sal.
Amen, brothers. And thank you very much for your kindness. I have to tell you, it's been very discouraging sometimes because I just feel like I'm fighting alone all the time. And you all have really given me a lot of encouragement. So I can't thank you guys enough. So
Same here.
No problem.
We appreciate. I think we've all probably felt those same feelings. So it's nice when fellow brothers in Christ and like-minded individuals can kind of come together and talk about these issues. So Sal, you're always welcome. Anybody here is always welcome, and hopefully we can do many more of these in the future. So Sal, thanks for giving us your time.
Oh, thank you, and thank you, praise for.
Anytime, my pleasure, man. It's nice having. I always learn. I'm picking off your brain and asking you questions. I appreciate all your answering your question. I mean, our questions.
Well, I'm learning a lot from you guys too. So I look forward to seeing you all, and thank you for anyone who's in the audience for hanging in there this long. God bless you all.
Well, I'll say, Salvador, anytime we've got your name in the title of one of our videos, we always get a ton of views. So people like you. People like you. People like hearing your thoughts. So thanks again.
I'll try to put something together. It might be a couple weeks. I'm working on a book for Dr. Sanford, so we'll see where that goes.
Of course.
All right. Take care, guys. God bless you.
God